Good morning to you all, and a very warm welcome to the launch of our book, Modern Monetary Theory, Key Insights Leading Thinkers. We're absolutely delighted to have you here to renew old acquaintances and for sure make new ones. Equally, we extend the same warm welcome to our speakers and authors, Daniel, Kostzer, Phil Armstrong and Neil Wilson, who will be presenting a little later. And of course, not forgetting Christian from the MMT podcast, which I'm sure many of you will know, with whom we share a joint objective to bring monetary reality to a wider audience. In particular, our sincere thanks go to Phil, who encouraged and inspired us to embark on this project, and to all those who contributed and supported this venture. And of course, can't forget here Edward Elgar Publishing, who made it all possible, and without whom I wouldn't be standing here today. Our last events, before, shall we say, events took over, were in February 2020. And it seems an age ago, and we are a world away from that time. So much has happened in the interim. We could never have imagined what was going to happen, nor the consequences, which we are still living through. History in the making, perhaps, as spheres of influence change and geopolitical power shifts. There's never been a time more crucial for humanity to deal with some of the pressing challenges of our age. And the work we are doing, we hope, will make a small contribution to continuing the public conversation about monetary reality and its implications for realizing concrete solutions to all those challenges by settling the question once and for all of how we pay for it. And the first time I stood in this actual room with my founding colleagues, Sarah, Claire, Deborah, Jessica and Patricia, was in October 2018 for the launch of GIMS. And I'm sure they will join me in saying it was born of a heartfelt desire to challenge the household budget narratives of government spending and show what it was possible to achieve with a better understanding of monetary reality. The idea that a simple concept outlined in its description could, with the right approach, play a part in finding solutions to the key challenges that we face. We had no idea where it would lead, nor what it could achieve, but we embarked on that project with both excitement and some trepidation, it must be said. As campaigners for the NHS, we had all observed close to a decade of austerity thinking and its consequences for public infrastructure. And we'd witnessed the insidious rise in poverty and inequality, which feeds into all aspects of daily life, making it not just intolerable and in some cases life-threatening, but also damaging to the fabric of society. A situation which has been created by handbag economics of successive chancellors and the economic philosophy which has dominated thinking for decades. The arrival of the pandemic showed us in no uncertain terms the effects of austerity as our decaying public infrastructure bore the brunt of that crisis. It also showed us the power of the public purse to act when necessary to support the economy, just as it did in 2008 in the banking crisis. What we have experienced should therefore give us cause to at least question our understanding, while the prevailing narrative of how government spends is maintained and influences political decisions, the global economic, social, and environmental challenges will always be reduced to one of financial affordability, instead of the more existential one of planetary viability and human well-being. Along with our colleagues over at the MMT podcast, Christian and Patricia, we have shared a joint objective to educate and begin the much needed conversation about monetary reality, and at the same time connect those ideas to what happens to real people in real life, to create a bridge between the technical explanation and the economic and social consequences of political decision-making and spending, to show how those legislative and spending policies can either create the public infrastructure which supports a fair and equitable society and a functioning economy, or indeed the opposite. And finally, to change the debate from one which puts the emphasis on fiscal discipline to one which puts the true actors in full view, real resources, how they are distributed, and who benefits. In the words of John Maynard Keynes, anything we can actually do, we can afford. So, almost 5 years on, as we have navigated as best we could the events that have proved challenging to us all, we have nevertheless maintained our work on social media, got to grips with Zoom for online events, kept our website refreshed, and now, with the publication of this book, 2 years in the making, it feels a great achievement for a small organisation which only came into being a relatively short time ago. But there is much more to do. The publication of this book is not a culminating point of that achievement, but an invitation to think about what comes next. Now I'll hand you over to Phil, our chair for today.
Thanks, Prue. Just going back to 2018, I was sort of sitting where you are, probably where you are, Steve. I was smiling more, but sorry. Now, if you've you know what's coming, you've spoken to me before. Obviously, I was sitting where you are, listening to Prue and Sarah and Claire, who's behind the camera today, and they are inspiring people. Let's be honest, because a lot of, particularly men of a certain age, like to sit in pubs and restaurants talking about how correct the world, but we don't actually do anything about it. No, guilty. And so, since 2018, I've written a little bit of stuff, done a PhD in old age, met up with my great friend Christian regularly on the podcast and told a few funny stories. I did write a book which was part of my PhD research for Edward Elgar, and that's what gave me the idea it might be a nice idea for maybe a GIMS project at some point, but we'll get to that later. I think I'm one of the few people who's written a book and is still running at a loss, mainly because what I did was they said to me, do you want to pay the indexer out of the royalties or up front? So I said, I'll pay it out of the royalties, and the indexer fee is still bigger than the royalties. But don't feel you need to buy my book at discount prices just to get me out of debt. I will leave that one with you. Obviously, you're here really today to buy the current book, Modern Monetary Theory, Key Insights Leading Thinkers. Got to get it the right way around. It's a fantastic book. I have to be careful with time because I like the sound of my own voice, like I've taught for 42 years, so guilty. Basically, what I would say about GIMS is basically they've not been around long, but they are already the biggest MMT network in the country, possibly in Europe, but a fantastic organisation, well worth everyone's support. They're a non-profit, independent non-profit organisation, part of this international movement to challenge orthodoxy in economics. Now, none of GIMS are, qualified economics professors, far from it. They're just intelligent people who've got passion. You can tell from Peru, you'll have been inspired, same as me. So you get inspired by people who are not necessarily technical, but want to make the world a better place. And MMT is a vehicle for doing that. So all of our writers are explaining the world. So ultimately, when this theory is well understood, it can translate into policy, which will make the world better for you, children, looking around the room, possibly even grandchildren. So, this is our aim. If we look at GIMS, have their own website. You've got a variety of resources on that website, for all sorts of levels. Andrew, thanks for coming, Professor of Economics at the back with Toralf. You might find, I hope, some interesting resources for your students. Hope so. No pressure. But also there'll be many of you who just want to read out of interest. Some people who are in the middle, if you like. So I really recommend the GIMS website. And you might want to ignore some of the stuff I've written, but honestly, there is some good stuff on there too. All right. So please go to their website. The one thing that GIMS have done, and I think is fantastic, is they've reached out for their advisory board to the people in the world that we think are the best economists, period. So you've got Warren Mosler, founder, Bill Mitchell, Randy Ray. Those are on the advisory board. Those are the big three. They're the best there is. So, I teach economics. There's no bias in my A-level economics teaching. So they're on the wall, and I tell the students, these are the best three economists in the world, bar none. All right? And I can back that up. Well, I think I can. So we've also got a younger generation of great economists. Pavlina Cheneva's writing in our book. We have our own technical wizard, not to embarrass him, that's you, Neil, I'm afraid. And I'll come to Daniel, who's Daniel is, probably a little bit younger than me, but he's also a core figure in the MMT movement. He knows these, as he put it earlier when I met him, he's been hanging around with this gang probably more than he cares to remember. So I'll talk a little bit about Daniel later. We're very, very privileged to have him. What GIMS do is they organise meetings all over the country where ordinary members of the public can come and hear about MMT. These are a mixture of people who are technically interested in economics or ones who just want to know what can be done. Obviously, the pandemic put a little bit of a pause on that. Sometimes they get the major speakers. It could be Warren, who's spoken on their behalf, or it might be Randy or Bill. And they have lots of these speakers who will do that. Sometimes it might be me or Neil, we're the associates. You could call us the backup gang, I guess, But it's always a great privilege for any of us to speak on behalf of GIMS. Obviously, MMT is growing the world over. People are beginning to challenge the narrative that governments say we haven't got any money. The oldest, if you don't want to do something, don't explain why, just say, well, I'd like to, but can't afford it. And people begin to think, well, hang on a minute, you seem to be able to afford that furlough, and you can afford all those tax cuts for the rich, and you can afford to give MPs a lot of money, but suddenly you can't afford to pay nurses and doctors. I mean, this is a bit strange. And ordinary people are beginning to say maybe it's not quite the way it works. I'm no philosopher, but I have a poster on my wall about nurses. It's called Schrödinger's Nurse. Simultaneously, too important to strike, but not important enough to pay. Well, if you think about that, how can that be right? I mean, you know, if they're important, pay them. If they're not, well, it doesn't matter if they go on strikes, we don't need them. So, MMT is coming. Just a little, moving from that towards this book, as I said, doing this PhD, I interviewed a guy for my book called Tony Lawson. He's a philosopher of economics, very interesting guy. And he said to me, why don't you publish your PhD research? So I said, well, who'd want to read anything I wrote? And he said, oh, trust me, they will. I said, all right then. So, well, I'll finish my PhD. And he goes, oh, no, don't do that. Publish it now, because it'll be out of date. So I said, all right then. And then he said, like, well, who would you recommend I approach? And they said, Edward Elgar. And it's because he then recommended to Edward Elgar that I would be a good guy to publish. So I did, as I say, I'm making a loss. But I had, if I'm honest, I had a great time with them. What I did is I just got all of my research, sent it to Edward Elgar, and they just published it for it. It was easy. So then I thought, well, I read, and Neil's going to talk about this afternoon, I won't embarrass him, I read Neil's paper that he wrote with Richard and with Andrew, who can't make it today. I thought this blew me away. I mean, it was a feat of technical scholarship. It was off the scale. I can't pretend I understood all the technical side of it, but it was a great... And I thought, whoa, this is impressive. But it was quite long. Would you agree, gentlemen? And so I thought, wouldn't it be great if the lads would agree to maybe reduce it to about 15,000 words, something like that, and we could put it in some sort of compendium book. And then if we could recruit the best economists in the world. Now, hopefully, I'm a teacher, prior knowledge. I've just told you how those were, so you'll all know that's Warren, that's Randy. Yeah, who's the other one? Bill, thank you. Well remembered, yeah. So, we recruited them. We also got Pavlina, we got Daniel, lots of other authors. I'll tell you all the authors are. Actually, obviously, Richard's writing his own chapter, which is a fantastic chapter, Credit in the Exchequer. We've got Randy's writing with Yeva Nersisyan on sovereign nations and facing real constraints. John T. Harvey about the pound. We have Bill again writing about Brexit and the Eurozone. Unfortunately, I wrote a chapter, so I'll be presenting that later. Apologies about that. Jointly with Jamie Morgan, who's a genius, and he did about 90% of the work. Neil wrote his own chapter. Daniel wrote a chapter. Pavlina, as I said. And then Deborah and Jessica, who are founder members of GIMS, have also written a chapter. So fantastic array of authors, unmatched. The problem I had was I had this idea that wouldn't it be great, but who would they write for? If I got in touch with Bill and Warren and said, will you write a book with me? No chance. But who would they write for? National treasures. Now, not to embarrass the GIMS girls, Bill Mitchell famously called Claire, Prue and Sarah national treasures. So when you get in touch with Bill Mitchell, and he can be sometimes a little bit difficult to get in touch with, sometimes a wonderful guy, very busy. If you say, will you write for me? No chance. Will you write for national treasures? Yes. Once Bill on board and Warren's on board, Randy's on board as our lead editor, the rest kind of flows from that point. So basically, it's a fantastic book. Great authors. These authors all writing for the GIMS. It's their book. It's because of how highly the GIMS are valued. They are inspirational people, and I hope you'll take a bit of that away today. The one thing I would say, I think this book is a landmark achievement, and obviously I think it's the most important economics book written anywhere in the world in 2023. I'm a little bit biased. So please enjoy it. Now, of our speakers, we're putting Daniel on first. Okay. It's a great privilege to have Daniel with us. He's come from Argentina via Brussels, I think. Is that right? So he's travelled a long way to be part of the project. He was recruited by Matt Forstater, who was a leading MMT figure, but unfortunately Matt's unwell and couldn't write his own chapter, but Daniel agreed to keep going. He's written a fabulous chapter, and I'll just tell you a little bit about Daniel. Forgive me if Daniel's done so much that it's quite a long introduction. So he's an economist at the International Trade Unions Confederation and a research scholar at the Global Institute of Sustainable Prosperity, if I can say that. Having worked at the office of the International Labour Organization up to February 2021. He was previously an alternate executive director at the World Bank, 2014 to 16. His early positions include senior economic advisor at the United Nations Development Programme, Myanmar, head of the socio-economic unit at United Nations Integrated Mission in Timor-Leste, coordinator of the Social Development Cluster at UNDP Argentina, Director of Research at the Macroeconomic Coordination at the Argentine Ministry of Labour, and Senior Advisor of the National Law Chamber. He has served as a consultant for the ILO, the ECLSC. If you don't know what that stands for, I don't either, but you can ask him this afternoon. The World Bank, the IICA and UNDP on economic development, poverty reduction, income distribution and employment and labour policies. And he was a member of the knowledge networks of the World Commission on Social Dimension of Globalisation, ILO. So he has been a visiting professor at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, Drew University, and lecturer at the Master of Applied Labour Economics for Development in Turin, Italy, and the ILO University Turin. He was also professor at the University of Buenos Aires, the University of Tucumán, that's in Argentina, a University of Jujuy in Argentina. He has published in academic and professional journals on the topics of economic development, labour markets, poverty alleviation and income distribution. He did graduate studies in development studies at the International Institute of Social Studies, Erasmus University of The Hague, the Netherlands. Applied statistics at the University of Tucumán and rural planning at the Universidad Simon Rodriguez in Venezuela. So I think we can safely say of Daniel, he gets around a bit. So I'm going to hand over to Daniel.
Okay, good morning everybody. First of all, this thing is the one that moves, right? Great. When he was reading my extensive CV, I'm in favor of stabilization in a job. I consider that people should have stable jobs and continuity. And when he read that thing, I said, oh my God, I don't do what I preach, But it's my great-grandfather left Russia in 1910 to Argentina, and my grandfather never moved from Tucumán in the north of Argentina. So I'm trying to compensate the lack of miles of the family by moving so much. But actually what drives me is the political will. I became an economist after being involved into politics since I was 14 years old. I lived the 70s in Argentina. Was a dramatic and wonderful experience when you look backwards. And when I decided what to do in my professional life, the only decision that I had, I say, well, I love politics, but I'm not charismatic to become a parliamentarian. I'm not willing to go on campaigning, kissing people, eating all sandwiches and hot wine, in order to gain votes. So I rather become what Gramsci used to call an organic intellectual I became an economist of the left. Because of that, I always ended up working in macroeconomic issues, but labor market. I joined the Ministry of Labor in Argentina in a period that was a complex period. I was there during the crisis of 2001, 2002, but I always found that this thing of being somehow a relative outsider. I was the most technical of the politicians. I was the most political of the professional and technical economists. I been always like what they call in Switzerland, in Geneva, frontalier, those that they come in and out of the place, and fortunately I had this possibility of being reading economic theory, but having the chance of applying it into the daily political thing. So here I will try to tell you one of these things that for me is important. I would say my chapter in the overall book, it's a little bit too operational. I never wrote a book myself. I hate my books because once I promised my mother that I was going to write an economic book that is going to get 3 Nobel Prizes: the literature, the economics, and the Peace Nobel Prize. So I'm still working on that. It's a bit delayed, the project. So what I'm going to try to do today is to show that these great ideas of the 3 wise men of the MMT, like Warren, Bill Mitchell, Randy Wray, things that I read before knowing them face to face, are the ones that draw me into the writing the first sketches of what was the Jefes program in Argentina, head of household, unemployed head of household program in Argentina. And a checklist because their ideas are great, but as we know, the devil is in the details sometimes, so you go and you express policymakers, politicians, people from governments, the MMT ideas, and they always will come with well, but, and this and that, the technicalities that sometimes are not properly developed in their writings. And that's why I think that when it comes to the implementation, this is what I can suggest now, 20 years after the implementation of a program that was quite successful, independent of what's happening in Argentina nowadays after just 4 years of a awful right-wing government. Leopoldo Maricel was a poet and philosopher of Argentina, and he said that from every maze you can get out only from above. If you try to undo the maze, you are going to be stuck. And the head of household program was a way of jumping out of the maze when Argentina was in crisis, having the convertibility plan that was $1, 1 peso, and was a currency board virtually. So Argentina those years was the poster child of the Washington Consensus. You can see the short one is Menem, the previous president, with the 2 Bushes and with Clinton, and they invited, as I said in the chapter, we have a massive process of deregulation and liberalization of the economy, accelerated financiarization of the economy that harmed the production, process of accelerated deindustrialization. Reprimarization of the economy was much better to produce soya beans than soy oil, for example, for exporting, and sudden increase of unemployment, informalization of the labor force, and financial globalization. The crisis impacted not only in the poor, the unemployed, but they also impacted the middle classes. You know, this is a guy, a photo of those years, a guy complaining that he brought money into the bank and he was thinking that he gave dollars to the bank and the bank told him that they were going to give him pesos. 19-20 December 2001, the country went into a crisis, major demonstrations, like 40 people killed all over the country by the repression, by the police. And the idea was everybody out, que se vayan todos in Spanish. The political system was on the brink of disappearance. Fortunately, and perhaps Mrs. Thatcher had something to do after the Malvinas War. The military was so badly reputed, plus the violations of human rights and all the trials of the human rights. The military wasn't an option as used to be in the second half of the 20th century in the country. So I show you some numbers at the beginning of 2002. This is the way that employment went down. It lost almost 25% of the employment in the country. Here we have on the top the poverty. Sorry, I didn't translate that graph. Sorry. And then the extreme poverty, the people that didn't make enough money just to eat. See how they ran. They skyrocketed up to the end of 2001, beginning of 2002. We had an unemployment rate of 21.6%. Informality was 37% of the labor force were informally employed, and underemployment was 2.3 million people in a country that had a labor force of 12 million people. So it was incredible numbers. So here I always use this quote from Sherlock Holmes, nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact, because it started a discussion. We did at the Ministry of Labor the first draft of this employment program. By the end of 2000, we already had the first draft. By mid-2001, we already had many things. So they come with all these slogans that we needed to answer. While average wages were going up, unemployment was also going up, as well as informality. So the orthodoxy would say, well, this is a clear indicator of mismatching in the labor market. If wages are going up and unemployment is going up, it's because enterprises, they cannot get the workers that they want, which is, I would say, I don't know if it's a right academic word, crap. Yeah. This is complete nonsense, because these guys ignore about the composition effect about the labor market. If you have to fire workers because you don't have enough demand for your products, who you fire? Do you fire the engineer? Do you fire those that they run the production line? No, you fire the guy that is cleaning, the lady that brings the coffee. So you have a composition effect. You have less workers, but average wages are going up because you fire newer workers, you fire less skilled workers, and you have something that Ava Lerner called labor hoarding, those that are essential for the production, those that are more difficult to recruit in the future when the production resumes. And that's something that we can see nowadays with a very clear demonstration in the United States, and to lesser extent here in the UK, where they talk about the mismatch in the labor market after COVID, because they cannot find the skills, and you have a movement in the beverage curve. We can discuss this later if you want. But actually what happened is that in those countries, like Germany, like France, like lesser extent the Netherlands, where during COVID the government say, okay, I pay part of the salary of your workers, but you have to keep the workers in the firm. When you reopen the production, they are already there to produce. If you said, no, we are going to send checks to the house, like they did in the United States, when you reopen the product, you fire those workers de facto. When you reopen the production, and you cannot find that people. So you have a longer period until you restart the production. So this is why it's so important to be careful about those obvious things that happen and have very clear policy implications. What were the ideas, the mottos that guided the design of this public employment program, large general public employment program? First of all, the idea that the labor market, and this sounds a little bit like a slogan, but it's very key for understanding the relevance of the labor market. The labor market is the gearbox that links, or the transmission mechanism that links the economy as a structure, the macroeconomic, the microeconomic structure, links with the well-being and the welfare of the households, because it defines the level of inequality, the level of satisfaction of needs, and also has some feedback effects in itself. If you consider that it's the labor market the decisive thing and all the institutions around, you start to think that, okay, perhaps the solution to macroeconomic issues or the solution to poverty issues has to come through the labor market, no other things. So let's focus on labor market tools in order to sort out. The second, this was a quote said by Richard Freeman, this UCLA labor economist, say, the problems of the labor market barely rely on labor market institutions. Labor market institutions are important, but their influence or impact in the real economy, it tends to be lagging. Sometimes it's not what you expected. So don't think that if you deregulate the labor market or reduce severance pay or bring some process of internships, you are going to solve all the problems of the labor market. You may on the margin, and it will take longer time. And then Bill Mitchell, he had the tale of the dogs and the bones, or the so-called skills mismatch, and a essay of a friend of mine who wrote another chapter of a book with me, that for all problems, let's find all solutions that work. So don't try to reinvent warm water. And the tale of the dogs and the bones, I don't know if you ever heard it from Bill Mitchell. He said, okay, you have 100 dogs and you have 50 bones, and you put the bones in the park, you send the dogs to find the bones, and then you will have 50 dogs will come with the bone, 50 dogs without the bone. So you say, okay, these guys, those that they are without the bone, they didn't have enough skills to find the bone. So you train the 50 that didn't get the bone. So you send them again, the 100 dogs to the park with the 50 bones, and you will have 50 dogs with bones. Some of them are the old ones, some of them are the new that you train, and then you have your control population there, all these Heckman statistical gibberish. And the problem is not the skills of the people, the problem is the lack of jobs. So if you train people to get a job when there are no jobs, the only thing that you are doing is to advance them in the queue. You perhaps you are pushing further, but it's not that you are going to hire more people. So there, it came the head of household program, which was that the idea of an employment guarantee. The government will make jobs available to everybody as a fixed wage rate. All those that they are willing to get that remuneration, they can get these jobs. The individual must make a commitment that he will go to work. The number of hours that was defined. In Argentina, they work 20 hours per week, the work commitment. And the activities were organized in Argentina by local governments, some NGOs, with very clear and explicit projects. So the payments were done by the federal government. How did they get the money? It's precisely where the modern monetary theory comes. Just start to roll the machine and print money. You don't depend on dollars, That doesn't mean that those that they have 1 peso they can go and claim $1. No, you need their monetary sovereignty. Have your own currency. Okay, how was the implementation? I told you that it was a very interesting and quite spontaneous, because you saw the people wanted everybody out. They didn't trust government. They didn't trust politicians. It was very funny because you started to see the government cars with Ministry of Secretary of State. They didn't have chauffeurs, seemingly. So the minister would go in the front seat with the driver because they didn't want to be identified as an official car, because people would start to shout them, thief, bring back the money, bring my dollars, and blah, blah. So it was very interesting interjudicial and implementation. You have the national governments, the local governments, then they have the local consultative councils, that they were also a crucial factor, and NGOs and local organizations. The national government was in charge of defining the regulatory framework for the projects, because the plan was the plan, but they have different projects of typologies of projects. Define the typologies, approve the projects that they come from the bottom, from the grassroots level, from the local governments, validate the beneficiaries that local governments say, this is the list of the beneficiaries that we want to have, and would do the auditing, and also, of course, triggering the payment through the social security system. The local governments would design the projects, would validate the projects with the local NGOs, supervise the projects, and guarantee the local initiative to avoid contradictions or crises at the local level. The local government would subscribe the project sent. The consultative local consultative councils, they would have all these other type of activities that for consultation to bring a framework of grassroots participation, and the NGOs will adapt the typologies to local needs, propose the beneficiary, gather them, control that the beneficiaries would do the work commitment, and guarantee the project and the objectives. Which were examples of these projects? Public service projects. We had productive projects and the so-called back to school, educational skill development projects. In the public service project, you had a number of activities. I don't want to go into much detail there, but they are production of social goods that they were also appropriated by the same beneficiaries and the local communities. Then you have others that they were much more productive, that were also would help. One of them that was very important was the self-employment. And then back to schools, you have for those that they abandon school completion, or vocational trainings for those that they require. I will pass fast on the numbers. Perhaps later we can see. Which is the conceptual framework that we need to understand for the implementation of this type of program in a context of crisis? First of all, let's see which are the advantages, the political advantage. First of all, it's a global strategy that tries to or against the exclusion and poverty of the population. The second clear political objective is that it's not charity. The people feel that they are involved in a new social contract, sort of saying. Reducing unemployment, which is one of the worst indicators for governments. They are very sensitive about this indicator. Integrates excluded groups. Sometimes you have clusters of exclusion that could be geographically defined, socially, ethnically defined, and you integrate them with these programs. Allow the identification of other problems for further interventions that they could be in relation to health, child care, reproductive health, I don't know what's the name in English, sorry, and bring the overall society into this idea of new social contract. Because when you implement one of these massive programs, the idea of a new social contract is that society decides to do something as a community for everybody. Something that we saw, for example, when people used to clap to the nurses and doctors at the beginning of COVID, although now they don't want to pay or they don't like when they strike. Which are the social advantages that you have? First of all, you solve the problem of the insufficiencies at household level. You improve human capital at individual, local, and national level, because few things more erosive or corrosive of the human capital, even I don't like very much the concept, than few things more corrosive more than unemployment. Yeah, when you hire somebody and you see, well, this guy haven't been working for 2 years versus somebody who haven't been working for 6 months at the same level of qualifications, you make your choice. Yeah, involve beneficiary in collective plans and projects. You try to reduce the level of individualism that you have during the crisis, because when the crisis starts, the first thing that you think is, well, I know this guy because he drinks a lot, I know this guy because he gambles, I know that this guy should be crisis, but why me if I don't do any of those things? So the individualist behavior emerges very strongly in period of crisis. So with this thing, you bring them all together, you restore the networks of solidarity, and you reduce the pressures on unprotected informal markets. Yeah, people that is willing to accept any type of salary in any conditions, with any type of regulation of the labor market, when the guy knows, or the person knows that he or she can go to the employment program, the public employment program, well, those that they overexploit, gardeners, drivers, informal workers, they have less resources to do that. And at local level, well, these are quite, it's counter-cyclical, because you go against the economic cycle, improves infrastructure and proximity service in the region, generates multiplying and accelerating effects, and you can also articulate with productive sectors. If the public employment program is going to make an irrigation scheme in an area full of farms or small producers, you bring all together into the planning and the consideration of this. And the other thing is barely distort local labor markets. I remember when I was at the Ministry of Labor in the implementation of the plan, every time that the Association of Farmers in the northern part of Argentina, the governors of the northeastern part of Argentina would come and say, you know, with the plan we don't find workers. I say, okay, pay more. Say, yes, we succeed. Of course, you have to keep calm and show your good behavior, but that was like a like the goal with the hand of God, which is the checklist that I try to work. I know that the chapter that I wrote, it's a pain in the neck to read it, you know. Again, don't judge me with that thing. It's too technical, looks like a, you know, like reading one of these religious writings, 1.1.7.1, you know. It's but the idea is precisely to make it like a checklist. Perhaps today I would say that chapter doesn't belong to this book, but well, that's the problem with the editors. It's too operational. It's too operational. And then, well, I have another problem. I hate everything that I write for at least for 10 to 15 years. In 20 years I will say, oh, that wasn't that bad, you know, but let me allow me to hate it for some time. Which are the context variables that suggest or not an employment program? First of all, I don't know if you read, you can see well because it changed the colors. Which are the causes of unemployment? Yeah, it sounds a little bit, I would say, ordinary the question, but which are the causes? Because we could have different causes according to the pattern of accumulation. One would be what we call, and this is just to show off that I also know a bit of theory, if we have Marxian unemployment or Keynesian unemployment. Keynesian unemployment is the most common, the most clear, is because of the lack of domestic demand. The Marxian unemployment is because of the lack of preview capital accumulation. Yeah, that's why the implementation of an employment program in Somalia, which is a country that has been undergoing a civil war and lack of investment for 30 years, would have different characteristics of a program that is because of a demand crisis. People doesn't have money, yeah, so that means. And the other issue that it's important to analyze is, did you have a decrease in real wages, or wages keep more or less going, but the main problem is the unemployment? Because if the problem is not what's happening now, for example, in Argentina, we have very low rates of unemployment. The problem is that the money that people receive for their formal jobs it's not enough. Would an employment program work there? I wouldn't say so. You need other tools there. You need other tools to increase that type of thing. One of them could be subsidy from the government, but people it's already working and working many hours, so you would need something more complementary rather than the case of a public employment program. The other issue is, have been increasing the labor supply, or we have discouraged workers, because that also makes a very big difference in the way that you have to implement the program. And then what's happening with real employment job losses? How long have been those job losses happening? Because you may have very sharp, like we saw in the case of Argentina, that means that the jobs are there, they are not fulfilled because the demand is not enough. So as soon as you put money in the pockets of people, those jobs will be filled and will restore production. Or this has been a long trend, like in the case where you had process of a lack of accumulations. And then see the changes in the composition of employment. So, which is the main goal of the public employment program? Is job promotion program, or is poverty reduction program? Yeah, these two things are quite different and have to be analyzed. Because if it's a job promotion, the first thing that you have to analyze is who will receive the benefit. Will be the individuals, or you will try to work having the household as the reference, yeah? And that also depends on the composition of unemployment. If you have a lot of youth unemployment, it's individual. When you have that the unemployment is the head of household, perhaps you have to think more in a household arrangement for the public employment program. The other question that you have to ask is if it's important to provide training. What type of jobs are you going to put forward? Because if you send, for example, people for construction, even you may not think that it's a highly skilled activity, but you send me to put tiles or things or do electrical work, and the failure is guaranteed. You need to provide a bit of training. And the other issue is the short-term work, production of goods. There are all these questions but if it's a poverty reduction program, who are the poor? It's the first question that you have to ask. What kind of poverty? Are they employed? If they are poor and employed, public employment program is not the best solution, because the guy will come and say, come on, I've been working 10 hours per day I don't have enough money and you are offering me a job? Unless you pay me much more than what I'm getting now, I'm not going to be able to accept that job. The other issue is poverty is geographically located, because in large countries, even in not that large countries, this is a very crucial issue. And then comes the question of what kind of poverty are we talking? Because poverty is not homogeneous, and for this we use the so-called Catchment Matrix that was developed by Ruben Katzman. ECLAC is the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, the one that he couldn't Phil couldn't tell what meant. That's the regional commission of the UN, which started to analyze the complexity of poverty, something that started in the 80s, and it also gives a lot of information. And the idea is to combine two measure methods of poverty. One on top is the method of the basic needs, and the other is the method of the income. That means if you are poor because of your basic needs, that means the direct observation of the things. In different countries they use different things for basic needs, but in general they have housing, running water, flushing toilet, less than 3 people per room, children that attend to school. Those would be the unfulfilled basic needs. If you are poor in basic needs and also poor in income, that means that your income doesn't cover the cost of the basic basket for poverty, you are structural poor. But if your income is poor, but you have a reasonable house with running water, flushing toilet, the kids go to school, the problem is your income. Those are called the new poverty, the new poor. If you have an income above the poverty line, but you have these direct signs of poverty, you are inertial poor. You may have an income that allows you to buy the basket of goods and services that define poverty, but you don't have enough to have a better house, to get a flushing toilet or running water, or enough rooms. And of course, if you are not poor in those, you are in the best of the world, you are not poor. Which are the expected results that we expect from one of these programs? Impacts on the beneficiaries, that would reduce first the impacts on the income, reducing indigency or extreme poverty, and improve income distribution, or impacts on the labor market. You reduce unemployment, you increase the rate of participation, and you increase jobs employment. And then you have impacts on the community, where you have expansions of the local infrastructure, provision of local services, reduction of regional disparities when unemployment is very geographically located, and you strengthen the capacity of local governments. To whom goes the program? And there comes the strategies of targeting. I don't like the word targeting, because target on the poor sounds a little bit, like a hunting, but well, it's a concept that is clear. These programs would tend or would have to be universal, or at least with the rights-based approach. Everybody who feels that they should apply. But the targeting, for the World Bank and all this, they have some very sophisticated ways. Means testing. So those that they want to be beneficiary of a plan, you check if they have a car, if they have a DVD player, if they have a dish TV, if they have more than 2 mobile phones, blah, 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 blah. So there you exclude them from the plan. The second is proxy to means testing. You also check other things that they have to do. These two are very well related, and they are like a red lines or red tape to the beneficiaries. But if your problem is new poor and that they don't have a job, they don't have an income, this method don't work. Then you have the geographically targeting. You may say, well, the program is going to be like in India, only for the rural population. That's a way of geographically targeted. Urban population, they don't have access to the plan in the case of the Rega plan in India. Demographic targeting, youth, elderly people, you go into certain groups. There are some of them, they have a gender idea, so it's mainly for single-headed female households, or the community focus, that you go into the community and you say, okay, we can implement here or give you 1,000 beneficiaries, you decide who are going to be, which is participatory but also sometimes can be a bit dodgy. And then the worst one, the one that the World Bank suggests, is the self-targeting. That's the cue. You ration by budget, you define the budget, and only those that they really need, they are going to stand up in a queue for 8 hours in order to get the program, which is a little bit inhuman, but it's also very well theoretically founded by these guys. For how long is the other question that you have to ask. Unlimited duration. One time you get the plan, you get out of the plan, you never go back. Or free entrance, exit, and re-entrances. That's another alternative. Or you have a limited time. They say, okay, until the emergency is over, you define, we are going to implement this program for 18 months. And there you may have other type of limitations. Or then you have seasonal and limited duration. For example, in a country with lots of agriculture, like in the case of Argentina, you may have that in the sugarcane area or the tobacco area, they work for a relatively small number of months, so you implement the program for the inter-harvest period, the periods where they are, the idle periods of production in that region. That helps to stop the movement of people and going to shanty towns or precarious areas in the large cities. So, and you may do it every year or only for agricultural process. What's the work commitment? Something that I showed you before. You may have the development of infrastructure, or you may have other productive activities, but you could also finance, and that's something that was refined and done in the second stage of the Jefes program in Argentina, self-employment. People that they say, okay, I'm a tailor, and I need a bit of working capital, a sewing machine, and a bit of fabric, and I can do, and the government will pay me for a period of time for my survival until my business starts to move. I didn't trust very much about this idea because I thought that could be all this prejudice of entrepreneurship and the development of the private initiative of the people, you know. But actually it limits itself, you know. You got 100 people and 3-5 they have this initiative that they foresee a business, especially between people that has been unemployed for a long time or never been in the labor market. Then you have the public services, very important, and is where many of the UN institutions, they have their focus on child and elderly care. The care economy offers a big scope for development and should be promoted and developed as a strategy, according to my understanding. Or the reinforcing civil servants, activities that governments, local governments, which don't have monetary sovereignty, because local governments depend on what they receive from the federal government or the provincial or state governments. They could reinforce some of the activity of civil servants, but that can lead to a lot of inequalities and over-exploitation of these beneficiaries. So you have to have a strategy to introduce them into the payroll and the regular activity. And then education, all the ways of education, it's also a very interesting way. I used to make a joke even that if we bring all the beneficiaries, the workers in a big football stadium to watch the practice and the matches, we are already contributing to the development of the economy only by doing that. I'm finishing, so see some of you are perhaps a bit bored. Is this a silver bullet or one size fits all? By no means. The employment program, and here I should make a footnote, I should thank my son who has been playing with this artificial intelligence graphing and did all these Lego style things that I found really interesting to make a little less boring the presentation. The public employment program, it's like a tree. The big branch is the employment program, but you have to hang, not the branch, how you call the
Trunk.
The trunk is a program. The branches are many other type of programs. They promote, you need interjurisdictional dialogue, not only at geographical level, but also the Ministry of Development Affairs, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Education, with the Ministry of Labor, and also all these areas linked to the production. The idea is to reinforce existing activities that you already have, programs that they are too isolated, and you need to bring them all together into this, because you start to get information from these programs that is very valuable for other things, domestic violence. There's no better way to find in cases of domestic violence that when they get together, all the women that work in the program and they start to tell and they interact among themselves, there are many things that you can do with that, and we help to change, on the one hand, the effectiveness of these other interventions that they to be, as I say, isolated, but also the fairness. You have to cover more to make it more equally distributed or evenly distributed, and also all the coordination with the existing program. And here I mentioned some of them: child allowance, health and reproductive rights, education skill development, productive support, public employment offices. So you share information with all these other areas, and it's a way of increasing the effectiveness. And you need institutional dialogue, something that sometimes it's not easy. So to finish, we have to always keep in mind that there is no better social and economic policy than full employment in terms of development. Full employment is a development strategy. It's not only saying, no, unemployment is low. No, it's a development strategy, because to keep it and to foster employment requires a number of other macroeconomic, microeconomic, and social measures that help you to keep. But of course, there is no stronger contribution to human development than decent work. If you have full employment and you have decent work, that means well paid, with all the rights, union rights, health protection, social protection for the future. You have, that's what we call a human development. And that's why full employment is a development strategy that would allow us to put it as the core of what we need, and it's the idea of this modern monetary theory, a new social contract. A social contract that wouldn't consider unemployment as a side effect of capitalist development, rather a problem that has to be solved urgently. I would finish here. So thank you very much. We can continue the discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel, for a really useful insight into the job guarantee that was implemented in Argentina and how we should view it not as a crisis measure but a permanent feature of the economy, which not only provides a mechanism for price stability but also an opportunity for people to contribute meaningfully to the quality of life of their families and the communities in which they live. A very warm welcome to you, Phil, to a contributing author to the GIMS book. Phil has been a teacher for 40 years in the domain of economics, but latterly in engineering. He completed his PhD in economics in 2020 at the University of Solent and recently authored Can Heterodox Economics Make a Difference? Conversations with Key Thinkers, which was based on upon his thesis research. And I'd just like to say, obviously, he is a GIMS associate and he regularly interviews MMT economists as part of the GIMS events programme. So welcome, Phil.
Yeah, that book that Prue mentioned, that's the one I'm still in debt for. So if you see one, grab them quick, because they're very good price. And I get 150, I think, for every one. And I owe 103 quid, so you can work out how many I have to sell to break even. My wife is in the audience, by the way. So, right, I'm going to talk a little bit about my chapter. And basically, Jamie Morgan, who is my co-author, he is an absolute super brain. I mean, if you've got any economists, I know there's some of my friends at the back, they know Jamie. I mean, he speaks twice as fast as anyone else I've ever met. He's read more economics books, apologies to any economists, than anyone I've ever met. He knows more about methodology, philosophy, anything like that, than anyone I've ever met. So obviously I thought I'm going to write about methodology. There's a slope there, actually. So I need to recruit Jamie, and he wrote basically the first 70% of the chapter, which is all about methodology, philosophy, and then I chucked a bit of MMT at the back. I did kind of run through with him what I should say about his bit, and he seems to have okayed it. So hopefully he won't be too disappointed. He can't be with us today. I'm sounding like a guy at the Oscars when the star isn't there, so they've got to get somebody else to accept the award. It's got a nice title, Modern Monetary Theory's Post-Neoliberal Economics, the Role of Methodology Philosophy. Jamie invented that title. All right, it looks so good, doesn't it? There we go. So, really, we'll link a little bit to a guy called Jamie Galbraith. He's the son of the original John Kenneth Galbraith. He works out in Austin, Texas. He's I would say a deep sympathizer with MMT, Jamie Galbraith. He's written forwards to Warren's book. He's a very, very nice guy, extremely intelligent, top man. I have met him once. It was quite amusing, but I won't go into that now. So essentially he talks about the idea of useful economists. Now, I would argue that mainstream economists are in fact not useful. So really what they do is they hide away in offices, in their universities, often out in the US of A, and they train PhD students to do somewhat obscure mathematical modelling that no one really quite understands, but it explains what it explains rather well. The only problem is what it explains is not the real world. So it's like being a vet and being an expert on the unicorn. The only problem is the unicorn doesn't exist, and if you try and apply what you know about the unicorn to the real world, doesn't really work. And a good example of a mainstream economist would be, say you've got like a problem, I don't know, with inflation. They will zoom out and they will go, we're going live to LSE or Harvard to, Professor Bloggins, and you will go into his office, it's surrounded by books, they compete with each other for the most books that can get on shot, and they often have braces, and they'll say, what do you think about inflation, what should we do about it? Well, they have no idea what to do about inflation because they're doing mathematical modelling, which is really complex Sudoku. They don't really understand anything about the real world, so they waffle a bit and go, put interest rates up, and they go back to the studio. And you can see if I'm right. Try it next time as inflation. See if they actually say anything sensible other than put interest rates up, which in actual fact is exactly the wrong policy. So better to say nothing than get something entirely wrong, which, I mean, Tony Lawson, who was the guy I mentioned, he says that mainstream economics has got virtually zero achievements over 60 years, and yet they have survived. Now you wonder, well, how can they do that? And that is explained in my book, which I mentioned you can get today for a bargain price. So anyway, you don't want to spoil the surprise. So it sounds more complicated than it is, but we have things called open systems and closed systems. And a closed system is where, like, whenever A happens, then B follows. And most of the economics done in mainstream is based on that type of idea. All right, I won't go into it. Whereas the real world's got a multiplicity of factors all happening at once. So it's tricky, isn't it? So if something happens, how do you know what factor has changed what you can see? It's quite tricky. And when we look around the world, we see tons of events, and we have to try and work out, well, what are the processes behind what we see? And sometimes we can get that wrong. So if you were like, I don't know, hanging around in 1400, you might look at the sun moving around the earth, because it's obvious, that the earth's the middle. You can see the sun, can't you? If you went back to your wife and say, forsooth, Matilda, methinks the sun, it moved round the earth, she would think, well, obviously, have you been on the side? It doesn't need to be explained. Now we know it's the other way around. I hope we do. The sun is at the middle, apparently. So sometimes when we try and make sense of the world, it's difficult. We don't just see with our eyes, we see with, like, our whole mind. So therefore, the difficulty is, and it's not easy, what you've got to do is observe things, and you're trying to posit the mechanisms which make sense of reality. And then you have to test, and it's difficult in economics because of all this multiplicity of factors. If you can do that well, in Jamie Galbraith's terms, you are a useful economist. And I'll come back to that phrase. Neil's a very useful economist, and so is Daniel. Trust me, and Christian. Yeah, come on. Okay. So, all this mathematical modelling, it doesn't really get us anywhere, because come the crisis, all the mathematical models fail. Now, you see you got a car, and I don't know, it's a bit beat up, and brakes are okay if you're going on the flat at 25 mile an hour, but if you go downhill at 80, you're in the ditch. Now, would you agree? It ain't a good car. Now, mainstream economics is that type of car. It's a fair weather car. As soon as the financial crisis come, all of our models have failed. That's because they never work. You only find out they don't work, like your brakes. So they all failed. And even, our late Queen said, I won't do the accent, all right? How come none of you guys noticed? Oh. One guy, I think in America, said, it's a great understatement. There must be a flaw in the system. Flaw? Come on. I think there's a little more than that. Or they might think something like, we might revise down our estimates. Now, if you watch the news, if you ever hear the phrase, revise down our estimates, basically in English that means we were wrong. All right, you know, if you go to work and your boss says, well, you need to make sure you produce such and such, and you don't do it. Oh, sorry, boss, I'm going to have to revise down my accent. You're sacked. All right, anyone can say that. Any teachers out there, you know, where you're expected to get A's and B's for your students, and you only get E's. Okay, you go to your head and say, well, unfortunately, through unforeseen circumstances, I've had to revise down my estimates. It doesn't work like, but they've got away with it. Now, what I'm really saying is that MMTers are useful economists. They're not necessarily the only useful economists. I'm not saying MMTers are the only school to be valued. You know, I've got people around here who support other schools, to which I have some sympathy. Gentlemen around the room. But I think MMT does one thing better than any other school, and that is it posits the mechanisms which underpin the monetary system. All right? So I think Warren said once MMT is very unusual because the only grassroots movement about reserve accounting in the banking system. You know, it's not very kind of a sexy phrase, that, is it? Most people are worried about the environment. This is basically a grassroots system. Many of you are just members of the public with a passion for reserve accounting. So if you didn't know that already, you can go and say, I've been in a very interesting talk all about reserve accounting. So if I just move on to the next thing. Now, if any of you know Warren, he's the opposite of me and indeed most teachers. Most teachers get a small amount of information and spin it out over a very big area. I spent my career doing that. You know, any teacher's out an hour and a half, bottom set, you've got one thing to teach him, you stretch it out. Warren's the opposite. He'll say one sentence and it can take you 20 years to work out all the things he means. Now, he sums up, incredibly, MMT in those 2 paragraphs. Okay? MMT recognises that the currency is a public monopoly. Basically, you guys can't print your own money. It's called counterfeiting. All right? I don't recommend you do that. Okay? Taxes function to create unemployment. Well, basically, imagine a world without money. Well, you don't need to work. But if the government says, I'm going to levy a tax on you, and I'm the only guy who can give you the money to pay the tax, or you're going to prison, you are now unemployed, actively seeking work in the state's currency. Simple. Okay? Funds used to make payments to the government come from the government. Obviously, the private sector can't create state money. As I said, counterfeiting. All right? Taxes can't possibly fund money, fund government spending. Where did they get the money from? Where did the private sector get the money from? I've asked that at a lot of conferences. Where does the non-government sector get the money from to pay their taxes? And we have I won't go through, because I don't want to run over time, but I mean, you can imagine, well, I earn it, where do they get it from? The state has to issue money for it to be collected. It's obvious. In the same way, though, it needs telling, doesn't it? Because people in the Middle Ages, they remember that I said, they thought the earth was a middle of the solar system. Now we know. Obviously the state has to spend before it can collect. All right? Now, nobody will know, it may be recorded, but has anyone created their own money at home to pay their taxes with? No hands went up. You're either lying out of fear or you haven't done that. Okay, so that's the next thing. So the price level is ultimately a function of the prices paid by the state. The world is complicated, but the government obviously is the issue of the currency, so it controls the price level. Ultimately, I know some economists would go, it's a bit more complicated than that, and it is, but we'll leave that. Neil will tell you about that later. Right, so if you imagine, well, what's this national debt thing? Well, basically, if the government spends some money one year and collects a bit less back, where's the rest of the money? We've got it. So if I was the government, no delusions of power, you know, I spend $1 million and I tax back 800 grand. If you're any good at maths, there's 200 grand left. Who's got it? You have. So that's your saving, isn't it? And the national debt is simply all the money the government's ever spent that you've still got, well, if you're rich enough to have a government bond. Now you get some absolute clowns. There's this thing called the Cato Institute. And those of you that may have watched Peter Sellers, it's nothing to do with that. These guys get it the other way around. They think the national debt is a burden. I'm going to give you a check. If any of you've got a grandchild, give them a £10,000 government bond and ask them if they feel that's a burden. All right. I remember watching Frasier once, and Martin Crane said, "Gee, what a lovely burden." So if any of you guys want to give me some government debt, i.e. a government bond, I really take that burden off your hands. So obviously they've got it entirely the wrong way round. The national debt is good because it's the money the government owes us. Could it ever get too big? Yes, if we were all so rich, we had so much government money we didn't do any more work because we're super rich. Yes. Are we anywhere near that? No. Do we need to worry about it? No. All right, so it's like saying, well, I daren't go out in the rain, I might get struck by lightning. It's technically possible that one day the national debt was so big we won't do any money. But come on, let's live in the real world. So, what does MMT do about the world? Well, it looks at institutions, and it works out like when the institutions out there are different, the world is different. Under a thing called the gold standard, all right, you might have you heard of the gold standard? Basically, money, some people still think we're on the gold standard, and they can go to the Bank of England and convert a banknote into gold. Now, if you imagine, say you were the Bank of England, okay, when we're on the gold standard, and you've got a convertible banknote, all right, you might convert that into gold. And the Bank of England might be a touch worried that you're going to come and swap your banknote for gold, and they might think, I'd rather you didn't do that. So what I'll do is I'll give you a government bond instead, so that you can't convert that into gold, but I'll give you some interest on that bond, and that'll compete with the option to convert into gold. So he says, well, don't convert your money into gold, here's a bond instead. And there's lots of people wanting to do it, you might have to push interest rates up. So obviously you spent a lot, maybe interest rates might go up when you run big government deficits. Maybe under the gold standard. We're not on it now. Now you might remember a guy called David Cameron. Sorry. He was a Prime Minister once, apparently. Now he said on the telly, he said this is, if we run big government deficits to do good things, then the interest rate will go up. He still thinks we're under the gold standard. He doesn't know he thinks that. He does. Because nowadays, as you notice, you can try it yourself. Go to the Bank of England and say, well, I was at a talk and I want me gold. If you take them a tenner, they'll either say, go away, or they might give you a nicer, newer tenner. You won't get any gold. So basically, you can't convert your money into gold. So the government doesn't have to give you an interest rate on it. It can just say, now it might choose to, because it likes you, and nowadays governments do sell you bonds. They swap your convertible currency to government bonds, and they do that voluntarily because it's quite nice if you've got a pension fund, isn't it? If you think, well, my pension fund has got a few shares and they might bring me some nice cash, or they go up in value, but bit risky. But if we've got some nice edged with gold, that's quite good, isn't it? Because you know you're getting your money back because the government's got the spreadsheet. But it's a voluntary action. MMT knows that, it posits that mechanism. And it's obvious. Now I've told you. I hope. Right, so this is quite a complicated bit because I've quoted Tony Lawson, and he's one clever guy. All right. Now, essentially then, here's the problem. You might say, well, you told me that there's loads of factors operating simultaneously in the world, so how do we ever know what's happening? Well, Tony talks about, it's not my phrase, a demi-regularity. These are things that tend to happen, as he puts it, stand out in the flux of experience. That's philosopher talks, impressive. And he also talks about a thing called a contrastive demi-regularity. Now this is a shock something you were used to happening, and it didn't happen. Whoa! And this prompts a scientist to... So if you're a natural scientist, if you look back over the history of natural science, and I'm not a physicist or a chemist, things... Whoa, that's a surprise. How did that happen? And people try and posit the mechanisms, what caused it. Like I think it was a guy called Snow who tried to work out in the famous cholera outbreak in London. He tried to posit the mechanisms for that. Now, if we think about this without being too technical, if we think about MMT, do you remember what we're talking about with MMT? MMT suggests, okay, the interest rate is under the control of the state. If you wish, the central bank can control the interest rate. It's nothing to, big deficits won't push the interest rate up. Now, what tended to happen was that when we had a crisis, people actually bought more government bonds, would you agree? Because they were safer. So there's a bigger demand for bonds, and I'm not being too technical, big demand drives up price, so the interest rate went down in the crisis. Now I admit there's lots of factors happening, but would you agree then, this is a hardcore test. The bad guys, the mainstreamers, who say big deficits a la Cameron will drive up the interest rate. The good guys are saying, no, it's going to push them down. So, apologies for the tables. There are all the countries immediately who've got their own currency. Okay, so Australia, Canada, Japan, the UK, the United States, all of them got their own money. All of them, and I mean all of them, had much bigger deficits because obviously in a crisis the economy declines, doesn't it? Tax revenues fall, government spending on welfare goes up, so deficits went up all around the world in every single country. the interest rates went, you guessed it, down. Beat them. Okay? The problem with these mainstreamers though, they're not clever enough to realise when they're beat. Sad but true. The Eurozone was quite interesting because you remember when Greece had Greece had very high interest rates on its bonds, and people thought, Britain will be like Greece. Well, there's a difference over Greece, isn't there, because of the it's very insulting. They call a lot of countries the pigs, in the Portugal, like Ireland, these sorts of countries. Now, for them, their interest rates did go up. But the reason for that is, remember what I said, MMT recognises the institutions. Now, things have changed a bit since then, since Draghi said the famous, we'll do what it takes. But thinking about then, if you imagine they are currency users. So Greece had to fund itself. It hadn't got its own money. It hadn't got its own central bank. The ECB's the issuer. So there was technically a default risk for Greece. You could buy a Greek bond and it might technically go bust. So the bond yields or the interest rates on Greek debt and Irish debt did go up. But that's because of different institutional structures. The German bond rate and the French bond rate didn't go up, went down. So did the Netherlands. Why? Because they've got no default risk. They're supposed to be strong economies. So not only does MMT explain why in every single country with his own currency the interest rate went down, not up, contrary to the mainstream, beat them every time, and it also looks at the institutional differences with the Eurozone and explains the nuances to mainstreams can't do that. So that's me just saying what I just said but in fancy print. So same as that, you'd be pleased to know I'm on to my conclusion now. Nice touch. Okay, so that's just one example. What I'm saying is that MMT is different to mainstream economics in terms of method, philosophy, where it comes from. Mainstreamers, if you like, sit in offices, make up like what they call axioms, self-evident truths, build really, really complex mathematical models that normal people don't understand, and when they go wrong, they just say, well, the model's wrong, I'll just build another one, maybe with a bit of finance on it, which will go wrong itself later, and then I'll build another one. So they're a bit like guys who keep on building bridges and they keep on falling in to the river, and they keep getting good pensions and good jobs. I'm being slightly provocative, but only slightly. What I'm arguing for, what we're all arguing for, is a useful economics. Now, what useful economics? It posits real-world structures, what's actually happening, it puts it to the test, and once you've got that test passed, which MMT does, you can then develop policies based on that theory to make the world a better place, which is exactly what Daniel has just been talking about. So, really, that's what it does. Now, what you be thinking to yourself is, okay, that's great, but what we really want to know is the detail about when the government spends, where does the money go? Exactly. Now, if you've come for that, boy, you're in luck, because here's your man. After lunch, when you're fully 45, Neil will be doing that. But I'm going to conclude on that note. Many thanks. Now, you thought you got rid of me, but I'm going to introduce Christian now. Follow that, Christian.
I can't.
You can.
Lower your expectations.
No, Christian's an absolute legend, and I mean, great guy. I mean, I feel as I know him because I've been on the podcast so often. He asks me such great questions. But it's great to meet him finally face to face. What a great bloke. He's a writer and a comedian, so you can expect some quality jokes unlike mine. 12 years, he's just got the MMT bug. He's been writing about MMT, putting the message out there, along with Patricia, fantastic people, work very closely with GIMS. We all know they're national treasures, so by default, I'm afraid he is now a national treasure too, whether he likes it or not. They've done scores of interviews with all the best economists, all the great ones, and a few perhaps not quite so great as well. Patricia and Christian have moderated panels at the 2021 European MMT conference. They're giving talks for MMT for activists, and also they've been part of the MMT summer school in Poznan, Poland. So really, in a way, what we could say about Christian and Patricia is they're really key players in getting the message out. So put your hands together for Christian.
Thanks for that, Phil. I really can't follow anything that's come before what we like to do on the podcast. We like to just talk to people like Phil and Neil and all the MMTers and just get out of the way and let them tell the MMT money story. So this is actually not that comfortable for me. So anyway, thank you. Right, so my name's Christian, as Phil said. I'm the co-host of the MMT podcast. It's a podcast about MMT. We had a long meeting to come up with that name. The name, it's in the spirit of what we're trying to do with this show, which is to be plain and clear and demystify economics. I should wear these. And I do the show with my friend Patricia Pino. She's not here, unfortunately, because she's the clever one. I was just lucky enough to meet her, and for some reason she still talks to me. I'm not going to question it in case she stops. We've been doing the show for 5 years. We've published lots of interviews, as Phil said, with the MMT thinkers, including nearly all of the co-authors of the book we're launching today. So looking at you, Daniel, for an interview. And what we're trying to do with the podcast is take people who are curious about economics on a journey and unravel some of the mysteries around economics and try to persuade non-economists that it's actually very relevant to their lives and is particularly urgent to the survival of people and the planet, to jettison some very outdated economic ideas. So I'm not one of the authors of the book, I'm just someone who really cares about promoting the insights in the book. And this book is a great success, not just to the authors but also to the Gower Initiative founders. So congratulations not just to the talented authors of the book but also to the talented Gower Initiative co-founders themselves. So let's have a round of applause. And Deborah as well. So, right, but no. So yeah, my title is Why Mosler Matters, and that's referring to Warren Mosler, the co-founder of MMT, who has a chapter in the book. Let me get questions. No. Let me get this picture up. Can I get there? No, I can't. Right. Okay, here we go. This is me with Warren. We're trying to get him drunk. We're in Glasgow. He doesn't like Guinness. There we go. That's some information for you. So yeah, over the years, me and Patricia have been lucky enough to spend a lot of time talking to Warren. And as far as I'm concerned, Warren matters because he's great at getting people to understand some very complex things and also why money matters. And when I say money matters, I don't mean financial advice, I mean money as a system, which is what MMT and this book is all about. So with the podcast, we want to take curious people on a journey, and my backstory is I was one of those curious people around about 2008, the great financial crisis, and that's because my day job, as Phil said, and I hate saying this out loud, particularly in this company with all these legends, my day job, it's a real job. I'm a comedian, and somehow I've made a living for 23 years. No one knows why. No one in my family will tell you I'm not funny. I've been getting away with it for 23 years. I confess. I play places like the Comedy Store, the Edinburgh Festival. There's a wider international circuit that I play on too. Long story short, I'll just say that talking to a room full of sober people at 12:57 in the afternoon is a very new experience for me. I will try not to swear. So when you're a comedian, you're in this situation where you have time to think and read and process ideas. It's a privilege, and you get to think about what you think. You get to write it down because you want to come up with material. But you're also self-employed, and when you're self-employed, you notice times when it is harder to make a living, and when that happens, you chat to your colleagues, other comedians. It turns out they're finding it hard at the same time too, and you feel it when comedy clubs shut down, and the bar staff and the bookers and the managers, now your friends, after 20 years, they all lose their jobs, and you realize it's not just a case of all of a sudden we all just got bad at telling jokes and flogging beer. It's that you realize we're all in the same boat, we're all going through the same thing, we're all experiencing what I now know to be a phenomenon called the business cycle. And I was curious about why that happens. So in the beginning, I was trying to understand it so that I could write material about it. But then I would say the human stakes, as I started chatting with people and writing about it, the human stakes became apparent, and I just started wanting to just tell people about this stuff and get the ideas out there. And so, leaned more towards the podcast and the interviews. And again, that was just luck. I was lucky enough to eventually, I think perhaps through the Naked Capitalism blog initially, I was lucky to find the heterodox economists that have been talked about today, L. Randall Wray, Bill Mitchell, the other co-founder of MMT, Pavlina Chernova, who writes about the job guarantee and is an expert, Warren Mosler. They're all co-authors in this book. But anyway, before I found them 12 years ago, I was finding it hard to find anything useful about economics in the mainstream media. And I used to make this mistake, and I still do it, and you probably do it too. I used to make the mistake of switching on the news to find out real things about the actual world I was living in. And as luck would have it, in 2010, a scientific study was uncovered by, of all people, David Cameron. And it revealed the source of recessions. Now, I had been searching for this information for 2 years, so I was really excited to know. And the study revealed that recessions are caused by Labour governments. It's a true story, right? And the best thing about the study was, it was 1 page long, 2 sentences. Who doesn't love brevity, right? It was written by the outgoing Labour Treasury Secretary, a man called Liam Byrne, and it was addressed solely to the incoming Treasury Secretary. So you can imagine this was quite a scoop for David Cameron, because these Treasury guys were obviously trying to keep it hush-hush. And anyway, this leaked scientific study read, and I quote, "Dear Chief Secretary, I'm afraid there is no money. Kind regards and good luck, Liam." There it is. Boom. Smoking gun. Facts. Science. Truth. Thankfully, the new government sprang into action and did what was necessary, which was to put as many things on expenses as possible, like duck houses and moat cleaning for job creation purposes. But when you're stimulating the economy, the duck house construction sectors and the moat cleansing sectors in particular, it's important not to overstimulate the rest of the economy. You probably don't understand this, but the guys with the calculators, they do, right? And so cuts were made to public services, and 120,000 vulnerable people got down to the business of dying to reduce the government deficit. Ooh, that was a bit dark, wasn't it? Now, I told you I wasn't funny. Right, so I warned you. Okay. Later, it emerged that Liam Byrne's 15-word piece of forensic accountancy was a joke. Right? What a blunder. I mean, if it was a joke, surely he would have, I don't know, scrawled it absent-mindedly in a rush in barely legible handwriting instead of... Oh. Right. Okay. My point is, how can anyone in their right mind possibly suspect that this haiku might be a joke? And that's when it hit me. It's not neoliberalism or financial capitalism on steroids or regulatory capture that created this mess. It was one man's impulse to be inappropriately funny. Okay? As someone who's also not funny, but likes to give it a go, right, I feel some burden of responsibility to make amends for this atrocity. So on behalf of the comedy community, I officially apologize. Let's make sure this never happens again. Okay, now let's have a look at what went wrong for Liam. Here's Liam. Right, okay. As a professional, I'd say Liam fell prey to several classic blunders in joke delivery. The first one is context. Okay? Comedians tend to do jokes in comedy clubs because it maximizes the chance of your jokes landing. Okay? It gets really tricky when you start doing jokes where people aren't expecting them, like economic events, right? So context is key. The second rule he ignored was, as much as possible, know your audience, okay? Know your audience. The audience in this case was the incoming Treasury Secretary, David Laws.
Doesn't look funny.
Right, okay. Let's just say, right, David Laws was mired in an expenses scandal. It's like, look at him. He was not in the mood for jokes about money. Okay? It was possible to know this. If Liam Byrne had been a more seasoned humorist, right, he probably would have read the room, as we say in the business, and perhaps sensed that David Laws, a man whose job was to cut government spending, was probably looking for some examples of wasteful government spending that wasn't his second home expenses, which he was just taking and giving to his partner at the time, which got him sacked 17 days into this job. David Laws, again, David Law, a man who hadn't bought a ticket to a comedy club, right? Who hated government spending on anything that wasn't his boyfriend's flat. He sees the note, shows it to David Cameron. Okay? I think this is where, you know, he brings the leak to the public attention, and, like, you know, we're all, oh, that's what happened. Right, okay. David Cameron, himself a reformed joker turned prefect whose dope smoking nearly got him kicked out of Eton, where he was studying, you might not know this, he was studying the history of art, among other things, which in hindsight is probably how he saw potential for Liam Byrne's comedy to transcend genres. And as we all saw, he waved this piece of paper in the face of the nation and repurposed it to launch a live action tragedy. So, in 2017, the British Medical Journal published research that estimated 120,000 people had died as a consequence of policies informed by this new word, austerity, right? Which is defined in the dictionary as the condition of living without unnecessary things. But obviously we're living in a different time now, and in keeping with our modern era, fiction is now alternative facts, jokes are now policy, and austerity, the condition of living without unnecessary things, is now the condition of dying without necessary things. So, how do we stop it? I think Warren Mosler would say that austerity stems from a misunderstanding of the money system, or an innocent fraud, as he likes to call it. The title Why Mosler Matters is a play on the title Why Minsky Matters, which is a book by L. Randall Wray about his professor, Hyman Minsky, who once said, anyone can create money, but the problem lies in getting it accepted. And that's an insight that's a lot of fun to unpack. And it gets us to this question of what is money, but when you drill down into it, you realize the more important question is, why is money? And when you answer that, it becomes clear that austerity, unemployment, poverty, these are policy choices. They're not some adverse condition that occurs in nature, like bad weather. They're policy choices. We can unchoose them with the stroke of a pen. So a lot of us figure this out. We try to get the word out there by any means necessary. We make media about it, the Gower Initiative, run events, and make online resources, and now they've made this book. And chapter 1 of this book exists because 3 people, I'm the only thing standing between you guys and lunch, right? Don't worry, I won't pick on anyone. Chapter 1 of this book exists because 3 people, Neil Wilson, Richard Tye, and Andrew Barclay, spent a significant chunk of their lives figuring out from manuals and papers and acts of parliament and FOIA requests exactly how our government spends. And that's the title of their chapter, How Does the Government Spend? Their work mirrors a similar US-focused paper that was written by Professor Stephanie Kelton in the 1990s. And she wrote that paper initially in an effort to disprove what Warren was saying about money and how it comes into being. So let's talk about Warren. Warren is a former bank owner, a fund manager. The way he puts it, he's someone who's been trading money, you might say, for a long time. And the first time we interviewed him, he told us this story. He's got great stories, right? It's just, yeah. He told us this story from his days working at an investment bank in the 1970s called William Blair and Company. And he talks about one day, somebody phones him up, somebody from the back office phones him up and says, hey, the Fed just made a mistake. They were supposed to send us $30,000, but accidentally they sent us $300 million, right? And it turns out the person sending the payment was one of those, they had one of those old adding machines with the 00 and the 000 on it. They'd accidentally hit the 000 by mistake, so now they've got all this money, and it's real money. And so Warren's like, let's go and spend it, but they can't because it's after the close of business. But then they figure out they're going to make quite a bit of interest overnight, and they get excited about that. But then someone at the Fed tells them, calls them up and tells them to send it back. And Warren says, and I'm like, send what back? And the guy on the other end of the phone is like, you know what I'm talking about, send it back. Right. And so anyway, it ends up with the Fed having to reopen the wire so that the bank can send this money back to the Fed. So the punchline to the story, as Warren tells it, is where did the money come from? It came from a guy's thumb, right? So, for those of us like trying to get to the bottom of like what is money and where does it come from, this is great news. Okay, we got to make more of those thumbs. We got to find out where that thumb is. And central bankers also blurt this out from time to time. The chair of the Federal Reserve in 2009, Ben Bernanke, said on television, when the Fed wants to pay money to a bank, he said it's not tax money. We simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account they have with the Fed. So, as Warren puts it, the US government neither has nor doesn't have any dollars. It's the scorekeeper for the dollar. It's just changing points on a scoreboard. In the opening chapter of this book, Andrew, Neil, Richard confirmed that our government has the same relationship with the pound. It's the scorekeeper for the pound. So there's obviously more to the payment system than that, and I know that Phil put this caveat in what he was saying as well. The point is all the complicated stuff, it's in the book, and then obviously no pressure, Neil. You're going to have to explain it later. But we're underlining this because when you talk about money in public, I've found there's inevitably some people who will say you're wrong because you didn't talk about endogenous money, or you're wrong because you didn't talk about the way the reserve system works, or QE, or yield curve control, or Zimbabwe, or Venezuela. Let me just say, this book is 303 pages long. Our podcast, we're on episode 167. MMT scholarly work goes back more than 25 years. Trust me, we've talked about your pet money thing. Okay, you'll find it. All right. So, as much as people like to debate the origins of money, what we know now is what we do know and what we can know is how the money system works now, because banks, as Neil et al. Found, are quite fussy about keeping records and keeping track of who's got what, because it's kind of their job. So we know now how the government's money comes into being. So I'm going to pull a quote out from a paper that was written by the three authors of Chapter 1, and also Josh Ryan Collins and Asker Voldsgaard from UCL. Quote, the UK government creates new money and purchasing power when it undertakes expenditure rather than spending being financed by taxation from or debt issuance to the private sector, end quote. So I'm happy for people to be skeptical about this money story that we're laying out if it leads them to do the reading. And I can recommend a great book for the skeptics. It's called MMT, Key Insights Leading Thinkers. So the government can't run out of money. It's not revenue constrained. That's not the whole of MMT. Okay, that's a jumping off point. There are consequences and outcomes arising from government spending, but running out of money isn't one of them. So what we're trying to do is get that question off the table so that we can put real issues on the table. I think we should be saying, okay, given that this is how governments spend in the real world, what are the optimal outcomes? What should we be pushing for? And to answer that, I'm going to use a model that was introduced a few years ago at a conference by Warren. Warren calls this turning litter into money. Okay, for anybody new here, what does he mean by that? So Warren what he used to do sometimes in a situation like this is he would hold up one of his business cards and say, okay, this is my business card. Who would like to stay behind after this talk and clean the floor? I'll pay one business card an hour. Quite rightly, he gets the same reaction, right? He's like, nobody is motivated at that point to clean the floor. And he says, all right, okay, how about if I pay 2 business cards an hour? Huh? 2, that's double, right? And, and obviously 10 business cards. Nobody wants to clean the floor for his business cards because they are truly worthless pieces of paper. But then he says, oh, I forgot, one more thing. There's only one door out of here, and there's a guy there with a 9mm machine gun. And he works for me, and you can't get out of the room without paying him one of my business cards, right? And he, obviously, when he's talking in the States, he has to qualify that he's joking. Right. Now, no, it's just pretend. You know. That's probably I probably like that story more than Americans like it. But so he's got this guy at the door. You can't get out of the room without paying one of my business cards. Now, who would like to work for one of my business cards? And at that point, he goes on to explain that the guy at the door is the tax man, and that taxation turns litter into money. That's the primary purpose of taxes. Stress on the primary. Once you've got a tax-driven currency like we do, taxes do the things we know they do. They create incentives, they regulate private sector spending power, but primarily taxes drive currency from inception, or they drive the model from inception. So the people in the lecture theatre now need to do things to earn Warren's business cards. And this goes back to that Minsky quote that I surfaced earlier, which is anybody can create money. The trick is to get it accepted. When you're the government, the taxes are how you do the trick. So the good news is the government can spend without operational limit. The bad news is that presents the government with two suboptimal choices. It can either spend too much money and risk inflation, or I'm oversimplifying a little bit because inflation demands what do you call it? Demand pull inflation.
It's cost push.
But yeah, okay, fair enough. Yeah, there's only one type of inflation, but the inflation to like too much spending chasing too few goods, which is like an oversimplified characterization. That's quite rare, it turns out, right? But that's the one that the central banks are supposedly fighting. But anyway, so the governments have this dilemma. They can either spend too much money and risk inflation, or they can put too little spending power into the economy, which results in unemployment. And in answer to that choice, inflation or unemployment, governments have always chosen unemployment, even in the good times, even under progressive governments. That's what monetary policy is, using unemployment supposedly to fight inflation. Never mind, no one agrees how it works or even if it works, but since the 1980s, that's been the only tool in the tool shed. So the MMT proposal, the way out of the dilemma, is for the government to implement a national job guarantee scheme, as Daniel outlined, which gives us not just full employment, but superior price stability to using unemployment to quote-unquote fight inflation. You can read more about how it works, obviously, from Daniel, and also Pavlina Chernova in the book. But just to make the point, and it's great that Ellis is here, I want to credit Ellis, who's sitting at the back there with this thing. You can make the argument, this is something that Ellis once said, you can make the argument, I think so, if I got it wrong, it's on me. You can argue that we already have a job guarantee in this country. It's a really bad one. Okay, what we do now in a downturn, or when the central bank raises rates to soften the labour market, I love that term, hey, we're just doing some softening. Who could be against that? What you mean, you're kicking people out of work? Oh, okay. So what we're doing is we're pushing people who want to work into a pool of involuntarily unemployed humans, and we pay them less than they need to live on and tell them your job is to not die. We need you to not die because, as any central banker will tell you, we require unemployed people to exist in order to control inflation. So please live, but here's not enough money to do that, right? So you're essential to the economy. Your job title is actually inflation fighter, but we're going to call it being on universal credit. And we're going to treat you like, to use Daniel's technical word, crap, for doing this job that we all agree needs doing. So our proposal is to replace this job with an option to do socially useful work paid at a socially inclusive wage via a job guarantee. So what Warren says is that the job guarantee returns us to the base case for currency analysis. What he means by that is, in the base case, you impose a tax like he did with the guy at the door with the machine gun. People need to do things. You impose the tax because you've been given a democratic mandate to achieve something as a government. In Warren's case, let's say he was a single issue campaigner. He campaigned on a clean floor. And he won the election. So now he needs to provision the public purpose. So he lays on the tax and he can get things done. So you impose a tax, it creates unemployment, but then you solve it by hiring all the people you caused to be unemployed, because that was the purpose of the tax, to employ the unemployed. It wasn't the intention to create employment and residual unemployment, because that would be dysfunctional, or as we call it, monetary policy. So this is one little inside joke there. Okay, all right. Tough crowd. So I know everyone's getting hungry. So this is what I mean when I say the why of money is more important than the what. Why does money come into being? Because the government needs to provision the public purpose to achieve the things it was voted in to do. Having a monetary system designed to mobilize resources and then not putting enough spending power into it or maintaining that, and deliberately keeping millions of people unemployed, is a misstep, let's be generous, a misstep founded by an innocent fraud, and the job guarantee corrects it. As Daniel writes at the end of his chapter in the book, the insights of MMT show why it's not just possible to introduce a job guarantee in a monetary production economy, it's essential. So we're not saying the government can't run out of money, let's give everyone a pony, right? We're saying if you're a currency issuing government and unemployed labour is for sale in the currency that you issue and you're not buying it, that's evidence that you're mismanaging the system that you're supposed to be running. And the MMT framework makes that clear, and to me that's why Mosler matters. I'll round off by paraphrasing Eli Devens, who said, if economists were told to study horses, they wouldn't go out and look at horses, they'd sit in their offices and think to themselves, what would I do if I was a horse? Right? It's pretty good, right? All right, tough room, okay. And the MMT economists are the economists that look at horses. That didn't sound right, but you know what I mean. Okay, right. So, but seriously, the only thing standing you're a horse fan?
No, it's like the dog and the bone.
Yeah,
It's not the best example, but it's very graphical.
Yeah. If you bring animals into it anywhere, it's much better. The only thing standing between us and a good life for everyone is an outdated story about money, and now we have a better story, and it's in this book. Thank you very much.
Entertaining and informative. Thank you.
Welcome to the afternoon session. So basically, I'm just going to introduce your final speaker, Neil. On his left, you will see Richard Tye, who is Neil's co-author along with Andrew for the main first chapter, and also both Neil and Richard have written their own individual chapters in the book, so they're both kind of significant players. And obviously when Neil's delivered his talk on the UK financial system, which I'm sure you're all looking forward to, a little bit technical, you have to pay attention, but you've had your lunch, you're ready to go. When that's done, then obviously we'll take questions from the floor. That can be about Neil's presentation, or if you want to talk about the others, or any questions for those, that's absolutely fine. So just to introduce Neil, Neil's an expert in finance and information systems, and one of the UK's leading thinkers about modern monetary theory, as you're about to find out. After more than 30 years in the systems business, Neil's learnt the hard way that operations rarely follow the manual. Moving from network crashes to financial crashes, Neil was intrigued as to whether the economy could be fixed with a reboot, which led him to MMT. His work challenges the so-called high priesthood of important grey men who refer to people as resources and who believe debt is bad for government and good for you. He dreams of a world where everyone who wants a living wage job can find one, close to their home, their friends and family. So I'm going to hand you over to Neil.
Right, good afternoon everybody. Very nice to be back in front of an audience again. I think this is probably the first time this decade I've got the opportunity to do this, so please be gentle with me. Okay, so this afternoon I'm going to be talking about the UK financial system and, importantly, how to use it properly. So for those who don't know, despite Phil's wonderful introduction, my name is Neil Wilson. I'm an editor and contributor to Modern Monetary Theory, Key Insights, Leading Thinkers. I'm an associate member of GIMS, and I've been an MMTer since 2010. I came across MMT because of the great financial crisis. Clearly there was something wrong in 2008. Stumbled across Bill's blog, and the rest, as they say, is history. I'm a freelance systems consultant by trade. What does a systems consultant do? I work out what's broken, and then I fix it in the real world. And I've been doing that for 30 years, so I might have a bit of expertise in this particular area. Now, to me, the economy is just another system that is broken and needs fixing, and MMT is by far the most useful tool in helping me do that. First, we'll take an overview of the UK financial system, a 30,000 foot overview on how it operates, and then we'll look at what we can actually do with it. Now, chapter 1 of the book goes into this in much more detail, of course, and we've also got another paper out on the GIMS website, The Accounting Model of the UK Exchequer, which goes into more detail than most people can cope with. Including, frankly, most of the economists who's running around. Okay, so we'll go into an overview of the financial sector. This is the picture that we've come up with. These are the main institutions and how they fit into the overall picture. You've got the public sector there on the left. You've got the private sector on the right, and they are spanned by the Bank of England. Now, it's probably worth pausing just at this particular point to explain a couple of MMT terms that people get confused about. When MMTers talk about the government sector, what they're talking about is the public sector, including the Bank of England, or the majority of it. And when we're talking about the non-government sector, we're talking about the private sector, excluding the Bank of England. You will find, if you look at other definitions, that it's the other way around. MMT puts the Bank of England directly into the public sector remit. And you might ask, where's the foreign sector on this particular diagram? Well, there isn't one, because this is a financial picture. Sterling is closed on the liability side. This picture represents everybody who holds sterling, wherever they are in the world, and however much they particularly hold. And the reason for that is that for sterling to be sterling, it has to be transitively linked. That's a word I can't get out. New teeth. Transitively linked to the Bank of England. And we know that because look what we've done to the Russians. We've stopped them transacting in sterling, and the reason that we can do that is because sterling is a public monopoly. Here's a detailed schematic of the centre of that particular diagram. Note how the government sector and the non-government sector bisect the Bank of England. Above that line, the accounts of the Bank of England are known as public deposits. Below that line are the settlement accounts. Now, these are often described as reserve accounts, but that's really a bit of an Americanism. And the reason for that is that the UK did not have reserves until 2005. At the top there is a box marked the central funds. These are the main institutional structures that are used by the Exchequer to initiate spending and taxation, and each of those funds has an account at the Bank of England. And the Consolidated Fund is the daddy of them all. The Consolidated Funds account is also known as the Exchequer account, or to give it its full title, the account of His Majesty's Exchequer. On the left-hand side there is the contingencies fund, and the contingencies fund is like a parliamentary overdraft. So when one of the departments spends all its money that it's been allocated, but yet has got other things to do, it can borrow a little bit to cover the shortfall. Now there are two separate processes running across this particular structure. On the left-hand side there is the spending accounts. Those are the CF supply account and paymaster general account, and those allow reserve adds to the bottom part of the system underneath the red line. On the right-hand side, we have the tax gathering accounts. So we've got HMRC receipt and the HMRC account, general account. And those are the reserve drains from the bottom part of that picture. Importantly, never the twain shall meet. They are completely and totally separate processes, and that runs all the way up into Parliament. So let's look at that parliamentary process. Got to wet my whistle, otherwise I'll croak. First one's the finance bill. Now this is the one that we all know and love, except that it isn't quite what you think. The budget, as we know it, isn't the introduction of the finance bill. It's an introduction of what's called Ways and Means resolutions into Parliament. So when the Chancellor stands up on his hind legs and gives a speech that nobody listens to anymore because it was all leaked to the press the previous day, then at that point in time he's just saying to Parliament, I'd like to tax. And if Parliament agrees to it, then those taxes automatically come into play immediately, thanks to the Provisional Collection of Taxes Act 1968. So you don't get taxed by the budget, you get taxed by that. The finance bill is then introduced in March after that particular process and ends up getting passed in June. Now the finance bill is supposed to be a money bill. What does a money bill mean? It means the House of Lords cannot interfere with it. Now often it has other things thrown in it because chancellors are chancellors and they like to try and stick these things in. But the Lords tends not to interfere anyway, unless there's a particularly egregious, I managed to get that word out today, yes! A particularly egregious form of tacking, as it's called, then they'll just leave it be. Alongside the finance bill, at the same time, is a debt management report, which is published by the Debt Management Office, and the debt management report includes all the gilts and treasury bills that the Debt Management Office intends to sell over the forthcoming year. Importantly, none of this authorises 1 penny of government spending, not 1 penny. That happens in a bill you've never heard of, a supply and appropriation bill. You'll see this in the papers a lot. Not. This one, nobody's ever heard of. It's the culmination of what's called the estimates process, and the estimates process is the Crown requesting spending capacity from Parliament. The main estimate is a massive document produced by HM Treasury that includes all the requirements for spending for all the departments across government, and that's provided in May. And that causes a supply and appropriation bill to come about, and that's passed in July. Alongside that, in February, there are what's called supplementary and vote on account estimates. Those are, oh dear, we seem to have spent a bit too much, can we have a bit more? And this is what we'd like to spend for next year, please. And that culminates in a supply and appropriation anticipation and adjustments bill, and that's passed in March. Now, Standing Order number 56 in Parliament currently requires that all questions on supply and appropriation bills brought in on estimates resolutions are to be put forthwith, which is basically a technical way of saying there can be no debate on it. And the Procedure Committee of 2019 stated in fairly scathing terms, formal scrutiny of annual estimates is limited, and the resulting legislation passes both Houses of Parliament almost by default. Instead, the Public Accounts Committee has to look at things afterwards, write a few complaining letters and documents that everybody ignores. Now, from an MMT point of view, this is not an appropriate way to go forward. There has to be more scrutiny of price changes within appropriation and supply bills. They should be grilled really hard. And the reason for that is because price changes in these bills are one of the sources of inflation, and of course we talk about that more in chapter 4 of the book. Let's talk about government spending. Government spending is covered by the Exchequer and Audit Departments Act 1866, which I'm going to call the 1866 Act from now on, so I don't stumble over it. This is the Treasury requesting permission to spend, but not from the Bank of England, but from a chap called the Comptroller and Auditor General. The Comptroller and Auditor General, which is a mouthful in itself, sits within the National Audit Office, and he is an officer of Parliament. He's elected by Parliament, and therefore Treasury is asking Parliament whether it can spend or not. The Comptroller checks spending against parliamentary authority, and it grants a credit on the Bank of England account. The Bank of England is not involved in that process. When the bank gets involved, it's due to this particular part of the legislation. Issues shall be made to principal accountants from time to time on orders given to the bank by the Treasury. Notice it says shall. Doesn't say may, doesn't say if they feel like it, or on Tuesday morning after tea. It says shall, which means the bank has no discretion. The order is given to the bank takes that accounting journal, and it records it in its account, and that's how spending happens. Now the Exchequer account starts each day with a zero balance. So can you imagine what happens at 9:30 on a morning when the state pension is paid? Its spending proceeds on an intraday overdraft. That means that all government spending is borrowed. Now that borrowing is balancing, not begging. It is simply a consequence of how double entry accounting works, and it occurs at no net cost to the Treasury. And if nothing is done beyond that, then net spending is recorded in a Ways and Means accounts by default. And despite all the Wizard of Oz layers on top of all this, the default system occasionally shows through. How do we know that? There it is. That's an excerpt from the Debt Management Officer's annual review, the last and the most up-to-date one. And as you can see there was a £3.9 million overdraft, which was cleared by a temporary Ways and Means transfer from the Bank of England. So they do use it. Anybody who says that they can't is wrong. But you might ask, why does the Bank of England Act have no effect? Surely the Bank of England is independent. Does anybody actually believe that anymore? Really seriously? Surely the Bank of England is independent. It's got control over monetary policy, which means it can set the price and the amount. Well, government spending is fiscal policy, isn't it? That's the first thing. Secondly, HM Treasury directs the bank. It tells it what to do. That's in the Bank of England Act 1946. And the bank can direct other banks in exactly the same way. The Bank of England can tell other banks what to do. But even if we go beyond that and cast those aside, the words in the 1866 Act come from another act, the Government Resources and Accounts Act 2000. And 2000 is greater than 1998, which means if this ever came to a bun fight in court and the judges couldn't come up with an interpretive mechanism by which the two could be reconciled, then the later act prevails under the doctrine of what's called implied repeal, which means that shall trumps everything. Then there's the bank's objectives. The bank's objectives are, under section 11, price stability and to support the economic policy of HM government. Who sets the objectives? Treasury does, under section 12. Treasury can define what price stability means, and it can define what the economic policy is to be taken to be. What would we do as MMTers? Well, we'd set price stability different to what they've got at the moment. We'd say £100 of money in a year's time costs £100 and £100 today. There's no discount. That's actually how MMT defines price stability, and again, that's explained in detail in Chapter 4 of the book. And finally, within the Act, there is Section 19, which is the Treasury's reserve powers. These are available in what's called extreme economic circumstances, whatever they might turn out to be, and it allows the Treasury to change the objectives entirely by statutory instrument using what's called a modified affirmative procedure, which means they put the statutory instrument in front of Parliament, Parliament votes on it, and if they agree, it's passed, and that's what the objectives will be from now on. And if they disagree with it, then they cease to have any effect after 30 days. But finally, this is a constitutional issue. Can the bank really say no to a Parliament that has approved to supply? I don't think it could. And of course, Parliament has the ultimate veto. It can repeal this Act anytime it feels like it. So let's look at tax collection. Taxes have to be paid into the Exchequer account due to the actions of Section 10 of the 1866 Act. Now, these are subject to mandated diversions into the National Insurance Fund, the Northern Ireland National Insurance Fund, the NHS Precept, student loan repayments, and Scottish Consolidated Funds. And then, if you go through all those exceptions and you trace them step by step, you find they all end up in the Exchequer account anyway, because they're dematerialised via the Government Banking Service. What that all means is that taxes are settled with HMRC at the Bank of England by transfer from the settlement accounts of the banks at the Bank of England into the general accounts of the HMRC. Treasury pulls that tax from the HMRC into the Consolidated Fund via what's called the end of day sweep. Technically, that means that HMRC pays all government taxes, which I'm sure you'll be relieved to hear when you look at your pay slip at the end of the month. Tax is only added to the Consolidated Fund at the end of the day. Spending is done via borrowing intraday, and that borrowing happens just as a function of double entry bookkeeping. Let's have a look at the Government Banking Service. The Government Banking Service is an outsourced agency bank that replaced the Office of the Paymaster General. An agency bank is just a bank that's got a clearing account at another bank. Those clearing accounts are known as nostro accounts, and a nostro just means our money on deposit at your bank. External payments and receipts from government are made via what's called Grade 3 BACS. BACS is the UK's main retail transfer system. Grade 1 transactions are just the standard accounts to accounts that we all know and love. You've got an account at Lloyd, you pay somebody at Barclays, that's a Grade 1 transaction. Grade 2 transactions are for agency banks at a particular bank. So for example, if you've got a building society account, then when you pay from a building society account to another bank account, you will reduce the amount that's in the building society account, but you'll also reduce the amount in the clearing account at the bank, and then that will just get transferred to the other bank in the usual fashion. Grade 3, which is what government uses, allows them to nostro with any bank, and government chooses to nostro with the Bank of England. Every department has one or more accounts at the banking service, and that's topped up by Treasury on request. This is known as vote funding, and vote funding is budget money. For anybody who's spent any time in commerce and had to draw up a budget and then argue with the finance director to allow him to let you have that budget, and then you have to manage against that budget during the year, and payments only really happen from that budget money when the finance department countersigns the cheque or transfer, you'll know what I'm talking about. Government departments are exactly the same. Now, it's outsourced to two particular companies. The tax collection side has been outsourced to Barclays. That means that payments of tax are made to a Barclays sort code, one that shows up as the GBS branch, but they are nostroed onto two accounts at the Bank of England, known as the General Account of the Commissioners of Customs and Excise, or the General Account of the Commissioners of Inland Revenue. As you can probably tell, we've been there a while, and those are the two departments that formed HMRC in 2005. And again, they're settled at the bank by transfer from the source bank's settlement account. On the payment side, it's NatWest that does the payments. Again, payments are made from a NatWest sort code, marked GBS branch. Those are nostroed from the Paymaster General drawing account at the Bank of England and settled at the Bank of England by transfer to the destination bank's settlement account. Tax accounts are cleared by the end of day sweep. That's both at the GBS and at the Bank of England. And as we've said earlier, departmental accounts are filled monthly with vote funding. Right. Now let's look at the Debt Management Office. The Debt Management Office is there to fill in the gap between tax and spending, to sort out the net cash ad that otherwise would occur. They are the keeper of the debt management account, and they run two processes. The first process is cash management. DMO does cash management. It's via repos of short gilts and bills. It sells short gilts and bills into the market, or it buys gilts and bills back from the market. And the idea there is to achieve a net zero cash position, to remove any additional cash that's been added by government spending and replace it with what's called shorts. Secondly, we have a debt management process, and this is the auctions and syndications of longer duration gilts. Now, what actually happens is that the short money that was done in the first process is essentially transformed into longer money in the second process. These are refinancing operations, they're not borrowing operations, and they're refinanced with what's known as increased duration. What that means is the price has gone up. Normally, if you're doing commercial refinancing, you'll try and get a cheaper refinancing deal. In government, they go for a more expensive one. Within this particular limitation, the Debt Management Office tries its best to minimise the cost of its process, but its hands are tied given that it's been set policy objectives by government to operate in this particular way. And DMO explains this every year in its annual review in some considerable detail. Here it is in the annual review and the description of the cash management. The important bit is at the bottom. Automatic transfers from the government's Ways and Means 2 account at the Bank of England would offset any negative end of day balances, though it is an objective to minimise such transfers. Transfers are not required. It can fall through to the Ways and Means if necessary. That's the KPI that drives cash management and the overdraft that we mentioned earlier. Then there's the debt management policy. The reason that we do debt management is this thing known as the full funding rule. And here's the rationale for the full funding rule. The government believes that first thing, and it wants to avoid the perception of that second thing. No sound reason for it. It's just a political belief. And that means we can easily change it for something else, or better still, just scrap it entirely. So now we know how the system works. Let's talk about how to use it properly. What can we do with it? Assisted by the insights of MMT. Now here's a document by Policy Exchange on what government should deliver this year. Pick Policy Exchange just simply because they've done the work, save me the bother. They suggest 3 items. These 3 items are common across all ages, classes and voting preferences. Stop the price of household goods rising, reduce NHS waiting lists, and build more self-sufficient energy production. Let's take each of those in turn. Stop the price of household goods rising. Firstly, we've got to accept a fact. The UK is poorer than it once was. This is due to the impact of lockdown, which has damaged our supply chains. The furlough scheme is not been targeted as well as it should have been. It should have been more job guarantee-like. And of course we've got global factors like a war nobody was expecting. What's the best thing we could do? wait. Ideally, we'd wait it out, because what we're suffering from at the moment isn't true inflation, it's semi-inflation. Semi-inflation is when prices go up, but wages don't go up quite as fast. Eventually, that will come to a halt. However, people really, really, really don't like price rises. And they will support anybody who offers to stop it. And that's how the monetarists get a foot in the door. So we can't wait. Much as we'd like to, what can we do instead? Well, we can address some pain points. Firstly, we need to eliminate interest rate rises. That reduces the cost of mortgages and the cost of rent for ordinary people, and gets the price down for them. And then secondly, we should look at perhaps subsidising the price of energy and food, and offset all this by levying, say, gas guzzling cars. Now this is a general principle. We're moving the cost of needed stuff onto discretionary stuff. Putting up the cost of big engine cars is where we concentrate the price rises that are necessary because of the change in the terms of trade, rather than on mortgages, energy and food as at present. Now for starters, this should go some way to halting the price rise in household goods. Now we could go further, rationalise the public sector, have more employment taxation, but those are politically far more challenging. Note that there is no free lunch here. Any change has to be paid for by somebody in real terms. Reduce NHS waiting lists. Now this is a real toughie. Why? We've got a fundamental supply side shortage of staff. According to some estimates, the world is short of some 9.6 million medics. That's a lot of medics. To produce more for tomorrow, we'd have to do less today. If you're doing any training, that takes capacity away from the front line. You can't do training properly and do the front line services at the same time. There just isn't the hours in the day. So what could we do? Well, we could add a queue. The NHS pays by time, not money. And waiting in line is how we allocate scarce resources in a system that is free at the point of delivery. And we can shuffle that queue. How do we do that? Commandeer private medical resources. Once again, we're hearing stories demanding tax breaks for private health insurance because it frees up beds. That's a framing trick. No, it doesn't. Private health does not add capacity to the system. How can it in a supply limited system like we've got? Instead, what it does is it allocates scarce medical resources to people who have money. It allows the rich to jump the queue. Private insurance is the same as the fast track queue at the theme park. If you've stood in the pleb queue, you'll know exactly what that feels like. Now, if we commandeer, we would return to a system based upon need, not ability to pay, which is the central defining principle of the NHS. And it's not this debate is not even on the radar. Nobody is talking about it. Why? And finally, self-sufficient energy production. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of becoming the world's leading exporter of green energy products. Not because it is easy, but because it is hard. Might have borrowed a bit of that from somewhere else. However, the passion and excitement in that speech, from frankly a far better orator than me, is exactly what we need if we're going to deliver this goal. Wind farms, build them. Mandate solar on every new house. Anybody got a good reason why we're not doing that yet? I can't think of one. Let's get on with those grid upgrades. Let's talk about modular nuclear reactors. We have Rolls-Royce nuclear reactors in this country. Quite literally, they're built in Derby. Let's use them. And let's talk about synthetic fuels, because that is the storage for excess power production. It allows combustion engines to continue without destroying the planet. And we don't just need wires for export, we need to sell bottles of green stuff too. Why? Because the world wants bottles of green stuff, so let's get on and produce it. However, to do all this, we're going to have to tax to release required resources. as MMT would say. And that means the two scariest words in economic theory. Industrial policy. We need to decide to do some things and not others. The markets can help provide, but only if a clear direction is set and a cricket bat is parked in the corner just in case. That cricket bat is government as investor of last resort. Not subsidies, not more loans, but business creation from scratch. If the market doesn't deliver, they need to know they will lose access to their resources, and the public sector will get on and do the job directly instead. So, which method of analysis did I use to come to these particular choices? Anchorism. What's anchorism? Modern monetary theory applied to the British system, applicable particularly to the United Kingdom and past and present members of the Commonwealth of Nations. In other words, those of us without the burden of the reserve currency. What does anchorism give us? Full employment. All labour hours are permanently engaged. Stable prices, because we can then turn market competition up to 11. A stable payment system, even when banks go bust. And maximum policy space for government to undertake its socio-economic policy, whichever stripe of government that happens to be. How does anchorism do this? We replace rate adjustments with a job guarantee. We anchor money to a real world, non-hoardable commodity, labour power. This moves the stabilisation policy from the market for money to the market for labour. The labour hour becomes the numeraire for the economy, from which all other prices are derived. Now, this is the central innovation of MMT, and along with the use of floating exchange rates is why it differs from other post-Keynesian variants. Now, chapter 1 of the book, chapter 10 we've already heard about, and the chapter 11 give more details about the job guarantee. The second thing we need to do is make sure that bank deposits are money, which might seem odd right up to the point when the bank goes bust, and then suddenly you find that the bank deposits aren't money anymore, they're paid up shares, and you've got to take a loss. We've seen that recently with failures of banks like the Silicon Valley Bank. What could go wrong? A bank run by Californian hipsters. And deposit insurance isn't the tool for this. Instead, the state needs to issue one and only one negotiable instrument, money, and the central bank has to stand behind loans made in that denomination. Now, strange as it may sound, this actually reduces risk. Think about it. Which is more likely to frighten the bank? A bank. 10,000 small depositors or one very large central bank shaped depositor? Thirdly, we need to tax correctly. What are taxes for if not raising money? Now, taxes are fundamentally about reducing private sector employment so that government can hire those people instead. That's it in a nutshell. Nothing really more fancy than that. For government to function, the private sector has essentially to pay rent for its employees. So rather than the ridiculous complex mess that we have now, let's just make the de jure tax system match the de facto tax system. Businesses pay tax for their employees. The theoretical and practical reasons for this I outline in chapter 9 of the book. And finally, we need to allow the floating exchange rate to do its job. Surprisingly, floating exchange rates are supposed to float. That means they will move up and down. These movements need to be aligned so that they impact discretionary imports. That's actually the mechanism, the tertiary mechanism by which things are controlled. Now, we've got 3 chapters in the book on this because it's such an important topic. We've got chapter 5 by Bill on the structure of the external economy, chapter 6 on why the standard FX monetary model is wrong, and chapter 3 on the fundamental resource constraints every nation faces, and thereby which determine the limits of policy flexibility under MMT. As a nation, we need to decide which way we want to go. Do we want to retain the nation state and therefore democracy, or do we wish to be ruled by a global superclass answerable to nobody but their bankers? Anchorism is a distributed economic philosophy. It is a powerful tool that empowers us to tackle the challenges facing this nation, regardless of what other countries decide to do. With anchorism, we take control of our own destiny and pave the way towards a brighter future for our people. Let us declare with conviction that we can choose our own path. Thank you. That little thing on the right there is a link to my Discord server, or it might be a link to Pornhub. Who knows?
What's that?
Right. Discord or
I think we have a little bit of time for questions. How long have we got, Prue, do you know?
I don't know what time now.
10 to 3. Yeah.
That's 40 minutes.
40 minutes. So if you have a
We're not
hand
under
up,
any
I'll
time
take your
pressure
question.
to vacate the room. It's just everyone here probably has got time pressure.
Oh, right, okay.
But-
If you can just give me your name and then ask. I assume the questions are for Neil, but you can ask.
What do you mean?
Assume they are. You might have a question for Richard if you've read his chapter. Daniel's back. And we've got Christian, and it might even be for me. So, the gentleman here.
mine's Adam. I've got sort of, it's kind of a two-part question. Just one very quick one for Neil. Is there a penalty that the Treasury applies to departments if they use and dip into the contingencies fund?
Not that I'm aware of. No, I don't think so. It's just there's a formal procedure that they have to go through in terms of they have to write a document saying we need to do this. They have to put it in front of Parliament, and like everything else, it's just passed through on the nod as far as I can see.
And then this is probably not necessarily such as anywhere else in here, but do you have anything specific that you want to that you would talk about Labour's plans around creating a public bank and using that to increase spending, and why that wouldn't? I mean, I know what the answer is, but why that wouldn't necessarily result in full employment or the outcomes that we want? And just in particular, do you think there is a reason? Because it's a lot of what's happening and what Labour's talking about sounds like they're falling into the positive money camp, and you're seeing things like the central bank creating a central bank digital currency.
Right.
Yeah. Was there a question there?
Was there a question there? Yes.
What do you think about Labour's policies around in creating a public bank to replace the state, and why won't that work?
Right. So, when they say create a public bank, what type of bank are we talking about?
They want to create a specific public bank that will invest in the public purpose through loans.
Through loans. Right. Okay. Well, there are two types of banks. There are lending banks and there are investment banks. Now, lending banks are pawnbrokers with shiny suits, and investment banks are hawkers. They've just got, do you want some nice equities? We've got a few convertible notes, you know. So the trouble is which type of bank? What are we trying to do?
As I understand it, and they haven't, I mean, like all Labour policies, they haven't really fleshed them out. I believe they're creating a lending bank,
right, so
that will, well, it's effectively operate, rather than the Bank of England operating as a lender to government, it will just operate as a lender to society for commercial loans.
Well, I mean, there's nothing particularly wrong with having a publicly owned, ordinary everyday lending bank. Let's face it, NatWest spent the last 11 years as a public bank, and it did plenty of mortgages in that time. It's really a question of what they want to do with it. The problem that we've got is this constant desire to lend money to people and to expect them to pay it back. This is this obsession with interest rates again that's coming out. It's obsession with interest rates and obsession with lending money and paying it back, rather than just doing what needs to be done, which is there are those resources over there that are being used to do A. We want them to do B, so we need to stop them using A and move it to B, and just get on and do it. I don't see the advantage to it, other than it's politically tractable. That's all.
Can I just? The idea of a public bank, to me, the way I envisage it, it could be like to compete, and this is like this is a very low level of understanding of banking, to compete with the commercial banks, so that then whatever the standards you want to set, like, you know, if you want to bring interest rates down, the government just goes, you know, you know, to me that's like the job guarantee for banking. You know, it will set the standard below which the commercial sector can't go below. That's,
I mean,
you know, sounds like an alright.
If I may come into a discussion that it doesn't belong to me, but I think that one of the peculiarities of public banks, especially when you conceive them as development banks, is that they can focus into sectors that they may have. They are strategic sectors that you want to develop. Let's suppose green energy or solar panels, windmills or whatever, that the private sector won't go because are either investments that they require long period of maturity and the traditional banking risk-averse behavior won't help there. And with the public sector bank, you can move a bit aside of the market rules of the financial sector, but you have to do them not just to compete in the credit markets, giving loans for TV sets or for traveling holidays, because it's not a good business, not a contribution for the government, and on the contrary, you may face certain reputational risk. You know, public banks, they would be very much linked to the political cycle of the country. So new elections, new government, and you change the management, and would be very deeply scrutinized, you know, by the fake news and the media, and they will start to say, well, they spend in pens and in coffee, or so. Unless it has a very clear, like the BNDES in Brazil, very clear developmental objectives, I wouldn't, although I'm a state person and I'm in favor of state intervention, but I wouldn't get into that business unless you have a very clear developmental objective.
My biggest problem with it is that it's misidentifying the problem. So it thinks that...
Can't hear you at the back.
It's misidentifying the problem. So it thinks that the price of money and the amount of money available, so the availability of money, are the reasons why we haven't achieved what we've achieved. The reason we haven't achieved what we've achieved is because we aren't spending it from the state directed at what we wanted to do. So a bank will only make commercial loans and will only lend for people that want the credit. If you can't afford the debt and you can't afford the repayment, you don't get a job, you don't get any work, you don't get anything done.
If you'll forgive me, Chair, I do recall the 2017 and 19 Labour manifestos, and I am a member of the party, for full disclosure. It was called the National Investment Bank, and it is an investment bank, is intended, not a lending bank in terms of any sort of retail lending. Its role was intended to deploy, or to use in some ways from your talk, Neil, to take on some of the role of that cricket bat that you mentioned in the corner with regard to the direction of travel of investment by the market into, for example, green energy. There was a clear regional component, and there was also a link to the idea, and I know it's complicated, the way in which quantitative easing could, and this is going back a few years, obviously 2017 and 19, to the way in which quantitative easing could be deployed in a more positive way, so that commercial loans could be mixed with bonds that could be financed by the semi-state role that a centrally funded bank, initially funded by central government funds, could play in regional economies to achieve precisely the development objectives around green energy, etc., perhaps even training in the NHS that you pointed towards.
Why do we need...
So I think it was quite...
why do we need investment banks to do that? Why are we always trying to sell equities and bonds? An investment bank has still got to, you know, they sell stuff. That's what investment banks do. They construct a business of some description, they capitalise it, and then try and sell that thing onto somebody else.
I think the idea was that they would try to mix the finance that was made available with a part interest-bearing element and a part effectively of a publicly funded bond that they would in fact draw down from. So I'm not trying to.
No, I'm not.
I'm just
forgive me.
trying
I
to say
just.
what they said.
Yeah, no. Yeah, that's. I absolutely agree. I'm sorry. I don't mean to. Denigrate what you're saying. I understand that what you're just saying what Labour has said. Yeah, it's another one of those things where it's, why have we got the middleman? I have the same problem with the British Business Bank that the Chancellor has set up. That they set it up in Leeds. You look, it's got a huge amount of loads of people working for it and all the rest of it. And I look through the accounts and I think, what does it actually do exactly? Why are all these people being paid to do what? What are they achieving that couldn't be achieved better by just directly? What I'm getting at with the government as investor of last resort is to get away from this idea of lending and subsidies, and just go straight in there and say, right, okay, that's fine. We will simply capitalise a business to do that job. So if we want green energy doing, then the government just goes, right, there's some money. We'll take the shares, put it alongside, and then we'll hire a load of people and get on with it. I think that's how I'd like to see it. It's just this middleman stuff. Why?
It struck me the other day, and this is just me being naive, sorry to all the clever people out there. Investment means you're taking out more than you're putting in, right? Otherwise it's charity, right? So why does the government need to invest? Do you know what I mean? Like it doesn't need a return, No,
it doesn't need a return. But it's best. It's best if what you've got is the situations where it's pretty clear that the City of London and the capital markets out there don't do their job in various areas, and we've got to get investment into things that people don't like doing. And government's really the only entity that can take the long view that's required to get some of these things off the ground. It's essentially kick-starting the thing. It'll get it going. Once you actually get it going, all the money men will just come flooding in once you get it working.
But Neil, how would you conceive of that, what you've just described there, being delivered in, say, the Yorkshire and Humber region? Would you not need some effectively a kind of a government development branch? And I'm sorry, sir, from Argentina, I've forgotten your name, but Daniel, the way in which you describe the focus on development that is often taken by state intervention banks. You need, I agree with you, Neil, but at some point there's got to be somebody up there in Leeds who understands the regional economy, who understands that there might be a way here of mixing government spend structured appropriately with debt finance to make the private sector, perhaps, to give them a chance in the first instance, do this bloody stuff, mate. And if they don't, right, we're actually going to convert all of this into a majority stake. But at some point we have to explain how we move from the statement of intent to the machinery on the ground that will start getting those wind farms built up where the people are shooting pheasants.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah. I think Richard's got a point to make.
No, it's just
that.
the fact that it sounds very much like the idea of how countries like South Korea or Japan developed, where they had state intervention, built up industries, and then they released them. And this is why we buy Korean cars. It's why we buy Japanese cars, etc. It seems analogous to me.
Yeah, Ha-Jun Chang is a good read on that, isn't it? 23 things they don't tell you about capitalism.
I think the lady here is next.
Thank you.
You can, if you want to make it louder, you can press the button. There's a push button at the front.
Yeah, it's already.
There you go.
Thank you. It's Carol. Neil. So you one of the objectives you say is to stop price of household goods rising.
Rising, yeah. That's the idea.
And you talked about interest rates. You don't put up interest rates because that increases the cost of mortgages.
Yeah.
But there's a big gap there, that housing is one of the main causes of poverty.
Yeah.
The cost of housing. Okay, most houses are owned without a mortgage.
Yeah.
For a start, that's not the cost of housing, You know, and you look at the level, you know, the cost of living crisis we have. If you, with food, you can buy a bit less food. Energy, you might be able to, you know, cut down on your heating. But you cannot do anything about reducing the cost of housing. Unless you move, and actually moving costs a lot of money. The thing is, this is one of the big crises. It's housing, the
Yes.
cost of housing.
Yeah. The other.
Does your plan? So because we campaign for land value tax because it's land value that's the problem.
Well,
so do you include taxing land?
Well, the other half hour of this talk that I had to cut out because it was too long goes into that particular point entirely. Now, the reason for dropping interest rates, the biggest problem we've got with using this interest rate system where we're constantly moving interest rates up and down is it makes an absolute mess of the construction system.
Yeah.
Absolute mess of the construction system. If you look at the accounts of the large house builders in this country, Persimmon, Taylor Wimpey, Barclay, Vistry, all those, you look at what they've said in their statements over the last 6 months. They are cutting the number of houses that they are going to build by a third, 40, 50%. That we cannot have that. We have to build houses in this country because we've got a massive shortage of them. How do we know that? Because the prices have gone up. It's not hard. You know, we can make more assets. If the price of assets go up, we need to make more of them. So we've got to get the blockages undone in the housing market, get rid of interest rate rises, allow the construction companies to hire people. They hire everybody on subcontracting. Why? Because they know the interest rates are going to go up, so they can't employ them. They can't put them on training courses, so we don't have any builders. We've got a boom-bust system running in the construction market, which just completely cripples our ability to produce housing. You know, we've got to get that sorted out.
It's not just supply problem.
Hmm?
It's not just a supply problem. The majority, new houses, a tiny proportion of the total
Yes.
housing stock.
Well, no, but you've
It's
just
the cost of housing.
yes, but the cost of
It's
housing,
rents.
the cost of housing will be reduced if you produce more of them.
Of course.
Oh, it hasn't done so.
No, it hasn't, because we're not producing enough of them. We need to produce a lot more. Almost certainly, what we need more than anything else is to get back to producing public housing. Why have we not got a public housing programme?
They can't afford the land.
Or we just commandeer the land?
Okay.
What do you think the compulsory
Tax
purchase?
it.
What do you think the
That's what we
compulsory
do.
purchase mechanism is for?
Tax
So you
it.
just say we need that land because we've got to build 100,000 more houses. Why? Because we've got no social provision in this particular area and there isn't any rents. So we're not in the European Union anymore. We have the capacity to do what we want to do. If we need more land to produce more houses for people, we can just go, right, we're doing that. We take it and we give them agricultural prices.
Right, well, this could be a heated debate, I can see. Steve there has got a question. I'll give you your name, so you don't want to do that, Steve, we know that, but...
Thanks. We've made no mention, and I think MMT underplays the importance of what's being called credit guidance or window guidance, which is the purpose for which money is being lent. If you read this between the lines in your new book, you can see that credit guidance is implied. And to relate this to what we've just been talking about, which is rising cost of accommodation, whether it be rents or mortgages, in the Tony Blair era, there are more houses being built than household expansion. It was the creation of credit and the buy-to-let market. It was the supply of money from the bank lenders that was driving up the houses just as much as the shortage of houses.
It's actually both, because once you free off money, you'll get a big rush of that available. Okay, as all the excess collateral is hoovered up into bank lending, so you get pressure on that side. That has to be responded to on the supply side by building an awful lot more houses. We don't have this problem in cars. It's exactly the same issue in cars. Money's lent for cars, but the prices of cars go down. Why do the prices of cars go down? Because we produce a lot of them.
But also, if you allow me to add a little bit, the problem with houses is that they are not only a consumption good, they are also an investment. Yeah, and that double game there is what drives part of the thing, the speculation. That's why it doesn't happen with cars. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. Is that if you switch the housing market so that it's like the market for cars, then people stop investing in houses because the price of the houses goes down. They depreciate, which is what they should do because they wear out.
Land doesn't.
Well, that comes to Marx's position that after a process of over-accumulation, you have to destroy capital in order to restore the profit rate of the productive capital. Yeah.
The gentleman there with the t-shirt, white t-shirt.
So Daniel, how did it go? Your program?
Yes.
That was historical, right?
But I don't understand your question. Sorry.
The program that you were talking about was a historical one, right?
Yes.
But how did it go?
How did it go? The something I mentioned in the book, I think, is that these type of programs, they are successful when they disappear. If you maintain the program still going on, it's because you still have issues in your labor market and in your growth of the economy and your development. The program went down. The first big bunch of people were mainly court workers, adult males, that they very rapidly got into the labor market when the economy started to recover. And it's very interesting because in the places where you had a larger number of unemployed beneficiaries of the program, is the places that they generated the fastest the job, because the multiplying effects of the program were very, very strong. I put some numbers in one of the sheets that you can distribute it to whoever wants it. For every single peso that you pay to the people, the multiplying effect was 257. So that means that 2.6 pesos went into the economy of that place because of the multiplying effects. So you had first that group of workers, then it came the younger women, especially single women or with 1 or 2 kids, and then you had a very hardcore of people with much more difficulties to get a job, mainly middle-aged women with 3-4 kids, or elderly in charge in their households, that for them the cost of going to the labor market, the opportunity cost, is very high because they need somebody to take care of the kids, or the auntie or the grandmother who is disabled or things like that. So you have this hardcore of people that was very difficult to find jobs, that they were very difficult to get into the conventional market that was growing. The economy was growing those years at 6-7% per year, so almost Chinese rates of growth. And then the government, and many of them, they couldn't continue being part of the program regularly because of their household needs. So for that purpose, the government implemented in 2009 something that was a very, I fully supported that policy, the Universal Child Allowance. And most of these women, since they got Universal Child Allowance, they quit the program. So they went back to their homes and to take care of the family. So, as I said, it's if you have under those conditions that you have Keynesian unemployment, and the employment program, it's very successful. The problem is that the success of the program is when they disappear, and you know, politicians, they love to cut ribbons when they open things, but not when they close things.
Yeah, the gentleman here.
Could I ask a question to Neil, please? Could we go back to your original diagram of all the government accounts?
Up there.
What I'm interested in is the boundary between potential pounds, which I think is what you call exchequer credits,
Yes.
and actual real pounds, which count as part of the money supply.
Yes.
Is it easy?
If you're
Can you
into,
kind of draw a line on your diagram?
if you're
as
into
to
money supply.
Where's the boundary of the money supply? What's counted as money and what is counted as exchequer credits and not money?
It very much depends on
Which measure?
It very much depends who you are and what you mean. That's the trouble.
Okay, so there's no.
There's no.
Well, I think you're referring to reserves as opposed. So you have vote funding essentially, and that then they will then feed through once those are written down. That leads to reserve creation in settlement accounts. Essentially.
Yes, that's right.
I think that's what you're referring to. Is that
In
correct?
your first iteration of your
flick up to the one previously.
Okay, hang on.
in your first iteration of your accounting model, you have used the phrase exchequer credit.
Yes.
Now, is that your invention, or is that a sort of a standard?
Exchequer credits. We laboured over those for many months.
Try to work out where they are.
Yeah, and what it actually means.
Well, I'm labouring over them as well.
Okay, so
should I bother my head?
No, it's an interesting question. So, if you go back to, there is an 1857 report called the Report for Public Moneys. Okay, and one of the persons interviewed is a chap called William Anderson, and he goes through in great detail, having been asked by the commissioners how the system works. Okay, they were rediscovering how the system works. Those at the top level, they were asking people at the operating level, how does this thing work? And he describes the idea of vote funding, essentially, but that would be a modern term, and exchequer credits. And they are asking about almost exactly the same question. And the exchequer credits are when you draw money from the consolidated fund, or the account for His Majesty's Exchequer, and the Paymaster General Exchequer Supply account is credited. Now, they are credited directly, as he says, with exchequer credits. That's what we mean by exchequer credits.
And that's not yet money, because it's
precisely. It's internal. It's just basically a debit to the consolidated fund and a
what
credit
I'm
on the
saying
paymaster
is
account.
can you draw a line on your diagrams to show where the boundary is between money and not money?
So we need to go to the next diagram, I think.
Yeah.
You've really started somewhere.
The trouble is we haven't got both sides of the balance sheet here.
So, where would it be? So, where's the spend side? So we're looking at the spend side, so it goes through the NatWest side. So when it goes into, effectively, from the Paymaster General account into, so that Paymaster General account is debited, and then the reserve accounts, other banks' reserve accounts, are credited, essentially.
What's
So
that for?
is it as simple as saying the things in the blue field are money and everything in the grey field is potential money?
That might be the
Is
most.
that-
Yeah, it's a bit Schroeder. It's a bit Schrodinger's money, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's leave it there. That'll do.
Yeah, it's incredibly complicated because it's a three-way banking transaction, whereas most people think that it's a debit and a credit, but you get debit, credits, and nostros. So the whole thing gets very exciting.
Sorry, can I ask, why do you want to know this?
Well, we asked that question as well 3 years ago.
This is very people read the Lord of the Rings.
The whole point of the
Those are Bank of England.
This is Bank of England, so this
how
is
money
exchequer
is created out of thin air.
No, it isn't.
And I'm
that.
trying to
It's
find this
exchequer credits on the other
boundary
side.
between the idea of making some money and when actual pounds appear.
Right, okay.
Because that.
Are you writing a paper on this?
No,
No,
it's not. Yeah, I don't think we've bottomed that yet.
I think that's probably
Yeah.
Lawson. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we need to have.
Yeah.
Neil and Richard are just already discussing their follow-up.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank you for
And I
that.
would also like, also in your follow-up, I mean, you've made it fairly clear about how money appears from nothing.
Yeah.
But what's not so clear from your paper is how our tax money also disappears and is extinguished.
It's extinguished.
And I'd like that to
Okay.
be
Right. So
part
That's
two.
easier.
everything goes into there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then what happens is the exchequer, the central, what they call it now, the central. I've forgotten the names now.
Exchequer sweep.
No, that's what they call the team.
Oh, the
Debt management?
no, it's
No.
the
I can't remember.
the Exchequer Funds and Accounts team.
That's it. Exchequer Funds and Accounts team goes direct debit to there. That's it. Bang, gone.
Once it's in the consolidated fund account.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
gone.
That-
Yeah.
So what's in the consolidated fund account is not real money. It's
Well, it's sort of real money and sort of balancing at the same time,
Yeah,
so depending upon what mood it's in and what time, literally what time of day it is.
right.
Okay, and it could be an asset or it could be a liability. And the great thing about that is we'll not know, because they only ever issue a cash account for the consolidated fund, because I don't think people could cope if they actually issued a balance sheet.
Correct me if
I
I'm wrong.
understand
When
that
it's there, it's not in any measure of any measure of the money supply that
No,
we call the money
No,
supply.
it isn't.
Once it crosses that line,
Once it
so
crosses
that's what
that
we
line.
mean by.
Because
This is another agent
Yeah.
in the
The
so-called
trouble is
monetary
that
system.
the monetarists define what money supply is, and they set the framing for it, and they're wrong. It's as simple as that.
But
I-
even then, it's not MO. It's not. You know, it's out. Yeah.
I picked up from one of your podcasts. I think you said you've given a talk about your accounting paper to staff at the Bank of England.
Yes, we did.
How did that go?
Yeah.
How did it go? It was
Great.
received very well. Yes, yeah, they were very nice. There were no statements to the contrary. They didn't argue against us. They just sat there politely listening.
Whether they were politely ignoring us,
Yes,
we don't really know.
we haven't been invited back.
There was supposed to be a Bank of England man coming today, but unfortunately he couldn't make it, which was a shame. Otherwise he'd be able to answer directly.
I just I had to flag up. Daniel came up with the best response to why should we study this?
No, well, I said some people, they like to read The Lord of the Rings. You know? They read that maps and diagrams and go. Otherwise, Tolkien wouldn't sell so many books.
Yeah, that's a great question. The lady here.
So, in the mainstream media and New Labour and the Conservatives, the narrative, of the public purse, we don't have enough money, is, very unchallenged.
Yes.
One of the few places that it's being challenged is by trade unions.
Yeah.
And trade union leaders kind of getting space in the media to talk about, demands for higher wages and that those are not inflationary. And I'm just wondering, for the panel, are MMT economists or people promoting MMT working with trade unions? Because that seems one of the few spaces in public discourse to kind of get out the message. And last night I heard Matt Rack from the Fire Brigades Union speak, and he said, they're telling us that there's not enough money to pay public sector workers properly, but we know from COVID that they can create money.
Yes.
And it's kind of on the verge of that, and I'm just wondering if that is a space for getting those ideas out there a bit more.
It's definitely a space. We have to be careful with it. The furlough scheme that we've had at the moment has caused some of the inflation that we've got. So we've got to be very careful when we come to public sector workers as to what we can actually afford to pay them. Now, yes, they perhaps should be paid more, but we do need to talk about where the real loss that we've undertaken because of the shift in the terms of trade is going to go, if not the public sector workers. Okay. Now it's right that the public sector workers should not be suffering a loss, and neither should anybody else. But we've got to talk about where that loss has got to go. But we're not having that debate. You can't just create money for public sector workers. There's got to be something for them to buy with it at the end of the day, and we need to have that conversation. We are not as rich a country as we were 3 or 4 years ago, and somebody's got to stand that loss. The question is, who?
Working with the unions, I'm the economist of the International Trade Union Confederation. So, if that an answer, perhaps we try to. It's not always easy because there has been 30, 40 years of this campaign of common sense. In my house, if I spend more than I earn, I get in debt. And that's why I love this quote of Sherlock Holmes saying nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact, because that's obvious, but it's not the reality. There are differences in the different unions, as you mentioned, the public sector unions, and that's why this problem that you pointed out, we are not as rich as 3 years ago, you are not as rich as 80 years ago.
Absolutely,
That's also, you don't have colonies now, or as many, so that also makes a big difference. And that's why my objective of going into more the practicalities of the implementation of a program. I always take a joke when I make this, make this kind of presentation, that the caterpillar had something like arthritis or rheumatism, so was complaining. So the rest of the animals of the jungle, they say, why don't we go to talk to the planning owl, who is the one who will solve the problem? And they go with the caterpillar, and the planning owl say, well, I have a solution for the caterpillar. Why don't you get into the river? The stream is going to move you. You don't have to move your legs, and you will be okay. And everybody was clapping. Was the perfect solution for the caterpillar. So the caterpillar say, there's one slight problem. I don't know how to swim. I will drown. So the planning all say, well, that's operational. I only plan. So there are some things that have to be sorted out, In the modern monetary theory, and has been the discussion with all our the big names, the exchange rate, the monetary sovereignty has another condition, that is the exchange rate playing the role of the buffer or the wild card that adjusts all the system. And exchange rates adjustments, they have different impacts in different countries, different economic structures, in different stages in life. Again, 3 years ago, exchange rate wasn't a problem. Now it may become a problem because it affects other things. So in that respect, we have to be a bit more, I would say, not careful, because it's not a problem of being careful, but being more delicate in the analysis, to be clear. One word that I learned coming to Britain, on the granularity of the analysis, in order to see what will be affected. But you're right. It's we have to work with the unions, and we have to bring all together the discussion, because after all, it's also a political debate. The balance of power is behind these things,
One thing I noticed in 20, I think I'm going to guess 2019, the TUC put a paper out about a job guarantee. It was limited. It was targeted towards the youth and I think all young people, and but that in there it said nationally funded, locally administered. So if you know MMT, that's something that you find a lot in MMT literature. So that said to me, somebody involved in writing this has been reading MMT. You don't hear it anywhere else. So the idea is the national government is the government that can't run out of money, but the municipality is the place that they know what the problems are to be solved. So anyway, so something's going on there. But that's why I wanted to try and maybe talk to, say, Jeff Tilley or somebody like that, or just hopefully on our podcast, just to sort of sound him out about it, because I know he's Keynesian. Anyway.
I'll put you in touch with him.
Great.
I would
mention that then.
Maybe we could have one more question, if you think, is that okay?
Yeah, it's fine.
And then after that, some of the panel will be around if you want to catch up with them. So does anyone like to ask that last question? Oh, your hand was up fast, that was good.
Sorry.
Sorry.
I'm Guy. Thank you for a great day. I've had a great day anyway. I've really enjoyed it. I've tripped into MMT relatively recently, and I love the podcast, and great to see some faces that I've heard on the podcast, so it's been great. Thank
Hopefully
you.
that isn't a disappointment.
not in any way. I'm a bit sorry that I've only tripped into it in the last 4 or 5 years, and I realise people have been talking about it for much longer than me. I think what we got here from the questions is there's not a lot to argue with about money supply. The government checks won't bounce, but as a starting point, there's a lot to discuss when you get to the next stage. Is what should we be doing?
Yeah.
But what is obvious is I'm not making it into a fight. There's a very established world that we live in, political world, and to make some of these changes happen seems a really challenging thing to do. And I've had a great time here, but I'm worried that we're going to be sat here in 20 years' time in a fairly small room, all agreeing with the principles of MMT, but not really seeing any changes. So the question is, what does the future?
I asked Randall Ray, if you'll forgive me, misusing my power of chair. I asked, not as eloquently as you, I asked Randall Ray, there's a man of few words, Randy Ray. And
so
I
he's
said,
getting warmed up, is that right?
Getting warmed up. We went for a pizza later and he had a glass of beer and he was fine form after that. But, I said, when will it all change, like you were saying, and he looked at me and he narrowed his eyes and he went, when the old guys die. Now, I probably even said that on the pod, basically a lot of the old economists, they've got to recant. They're not going to go into everything I've ever written's all been wrong. I'm going to hand the Nobel Prize back.
Can't we organise an event with some really poisonous cake?
But so really, the young ones, it's difficult. It's very difficult because a lot of the time young ones will get drawn into the same thing. So, like in my small way, I'm just a school teacher. I say to them, if I can't convert you guys to MMT, we're done. I'm giving you the baton, so each of us, without being too boring at dinner parties, I used to be funny, apparently. But so at the end of the day, what you say is a challenge, but we can only, as a phrase, we can only do what we can do. So, you might meet someone in a pub and you might talk about MMT and they might be a teacher or there might be somebody with politics or trade unions. Christian's doing his part, Daniel, Neil, obviously the GIMMs themselves, Richard. We're all doing our bit like you, so it's like anything else. It's tough because we are fighting, we are dissenters, we're fighting against a very difficult system. But the thing is, I wrote a small piece on the GIMS called Tombstone for a Tombstone. I don't know if you've seen that. But it's the thing Tony Benn says. First they ignore you, then they say you're mad, then dangerous, then they can't find anybody else anybody who disagrees with you. Now for ages they ignored you. Nobody heard of MMT. What's that? It's just magic money. Now they're a bit nervous. Some of these financial guys are trying to caricature MMT and attack it. And they won't, and we've tried to smoke them out. Because they don't know anything. It's like busting the skin on a rice pudding, as my dad used to say. We need to get them out, So at the end of the day, it's a challenge, and but we can do it. And that's really my positive message to you. Go away and find some MMTers. You can make a few yourself.
And can I also say, even over the last few years, there's been a lot more people getting on board, and you see more people on social media joining these conversations and having some idea of what's going on and understanding that the things that we're told every day are just nonsense. But I'm sure the people who've been around for longer have seen much more growth, and our conversations with other people, all of us, they carry on with other people. Even my kids are teaching their friends at school, and it's just a matter of it keep going.
Daniel, I think one.
Yes, no. A couple of things that I've been it's being part of this gang for a long time, but that doesn't give me enough authority anyhow. I think that number one, we should be more humble when we explain the advantages of MMT. We have the tendency to treat those that are not in our gang like those that they think that the earth is flat or things like that, and it's not true, because they are subject of the overall belief. So we have to be more willing to explain, more militant in the explaining. They were asking me from Brussels, how is the audience of your presentation? And to be honest, looking at you guys, most of you are my age. I would love to see young kids here. Yeah, they are the ones that they can sponges absorb. We are, let's say, homeless. We have our experience. We had our failures. We should be more trying to catch, to grab, these young people, those that they are partially contaminated by the mainstream economics, but they don't make their living out of mainstream economics. Because how are you going to explain to some other people that they make their living?
Can I say something?
Yeah.
One of the things I think can be done, and Randall Ray has done it recently, is writing children's books. He's written a book, What is Money, effectively for 6 to 9 year olds. And it's very good. And I have a copy, and this is how you get there.
Can I make another suggestion? Can I make another suggestion?
Let me finish one other thing. We have this leftist vice of the narcissism of the small difference, as Freud wrote. We love to say, no, he's MMT, but not that much because this. He is partially, but let's stop it, neoclassicals and the business community, they never make that difference, They know they have their conflict, their internal things, but when they have to push governments, when they have to push the media, when they have to go with the message, they are a monolithic rock that they advance. And we are sniffing each other like dogs in a park, to see, is he the one that should be?
I want to push back a little bit on the left bashing, because it is very easy when everything's fine, you're in the business community and it's the status quo. It's very easy for everybody to agree. Yeah, everything's fine. We're like going, we need change, and when you get people in a room who need change, they don't all agree about it, and so that's why you see this more on the left. It's not people's front of Judaism. It's people trying to figure out what they want. That's what it is.
What we really need, Christian, is a heterodox paradigm, don't we? And I happen to know a guy who's written a book about that. Sorry, Mark.
My little suggestion, having worked in universities for a long time, I find undergraduates, young people, really quite progressive. If you are applying to university to study economics, you really have no idea what the course is you're about to do. I would love to see an audit by MMT people of all of the economics courses, say in the UK, and then publish it in a very simple way and say, is this progressive economics or is this old economics? In a very simple way that people at 16 or 17 years old that are thinking of applying to university can understand, because people going to universities have no way of knowing what the course is that they have not yet done. And then if you hit if that affects recruitment, then the universities are going to listen when it hits recruitment. But
can I just interrupt you there, Mark, just for a moment, because taking on Daniel's point, we do have a young economics scholar who's hiding there called Emerson. So I don't know if you want to respond to Mark there about, did you know what you were letting yourself in for? So here we have no pressure, Emerson, your average age is a little higher than your own, but what have you got to say to Mark then? Was it what you expected?
So
just tell us what you're doing, by the way, where you are, what you.
So I'm an economics student just down the road at LSE, just like coming to the last few months of the degree. And yeah, everything you said about economics degrees being just dominated by neoliberal economists is absolutely correct. LSE is known as like a stronghold of neoliberalism, and that is absolutely true, but I think it applies across the board. So last year I had in my main macro course that it was run by this economist that I'm pretty sure Phil interviewed in the book, Ricardo Reis.
Yes.
And he's this sort of, I think he was like voted one of the most influential young economists in the world a few years back. He's got like op-ed, he writes op-eds all the time, he's really quite well known. He's also a big MMT basher on Twitter. And so this guy, Ricardo Reis, he was in charge of this macro course that was compulsory for all second years last year. And he goes through like theory after theory after theory, which is just demonstrably false. So when talking about the banking system, it's things like we go through loanable funds theory, and you basically use that. So the idea that savings are then lent out, and that is basically the foundation of all that is taught about banking and how the system works. And so, like, although I want to believe that it's just a case of an older generation of economists dying out, there is absolutely zero interest or sort of awareness of MMT among most undergraduates and young economists because of the grip that economists from previous generations who have sort of got their education according to like principles that apply under the gold standard, that their grip on universities is so strong and university courses is so strong that unless there is sort of, I don't know how it would happen, but outreach to those people, it's definitely not simply a case of waiting, because they are replacing themselves with future versions of themselves.
Didn't you confront your professor?
So they
Let's
so
do it.
So
Let's get an award.
As a student of the uni, you get to book in 15-minute slots with whoever you like, which is amazing. And so it's quite fun to go and challenge them on this stuff. And so I went to Ricardo Reis, and for the first 10 minutes of the 15-minute slot, you kind of talk, you kind of ask probing questions like, what do you think of MMT? I've seen you've been talking about it on Twitter. And for the first 10 minutes, it's sort of, oh no, dismiss it. Stuff like, oh, they are trying to manipulate how you think and all this kind of stuff. Stuff like this. And for the last 5 minutes, after you've asked 10 minutes of probing questions, the line shifts to, oh, that's kind of what I was saying all along. And I think if any progress is going to be made, it's going to be via that sort of channel, whereby as we see now, people dismiss it and argue against it, but eventually it gets to the point where the line shifts to, that's kind of what we were talking about, and actually the only reason we were teaching you loanable funds theory is because it's an approachable way to teach undergraduates, and of course when you get to be a master's student, we then teach you the actual way. But in reality, it's not a case of they just teach undergraduates these old-fashioned, simplistic models and theories. It's a case of, yes, they teach undergraduates those theories, but when you become a master's student or a PhD student, it's simply an extension of those flawed theories. So it's not as if, once you graduate to being a master's student or go further, then we teach you the truth. No, it's just an extension of that. So those previous.
And even if
that's
it was
the way
true,
that
I
my
mean, a lot of
mother
people don't do
explained me
it.
about where the babies come from.
But I mean, so many people who do bachelor's degrees never go on to master's degrees anyway. So I mean, you've got to get them in the first.
The chap right at the back, you've been very patient. And
well, it's not very big. I was just wondering what become of the Manchester post-crash economics society, which should be an uprising, kind of remonstrance at the end of the
I don't know.
financial crash. And I just wondered what had become of it, and was there all there, and so on.
I don't know.
It just
There's a big thing at one point.
I was teaching international students at Manchester University just for the summer, and I gave them the manifesto of the Post-Crash Economic Society. But I was working there until a few years ago, and I didn't really hear anything of it. They had 1 or 2 conferences at Easter, and what could they do? I don't know. My feeling is that if you could somehow put MMT together with progressive, green economics, and just simply call it that, and then just say to people that are 18 years old, would you like to do a green thing, or would you like to do an out-of-date thing or traditional thing? And what are they going to say? Because
one of the main questions is, what is the people going to do? Because now productivity has increased, we don't have enough factories, blah, blah, blah. And the quick answer, but it's very accurate, it's green economy and the care economy.
It's what people care
where we have a huge deficit. But for some people it's very difficult to visualize that those could be activities. Well, what are you going to do in the green economy? They imagine just a big a solar panel or things like that. There are many other things that you can do there, from the recycling, reprocessing, many things. And the care economy is not only a problem of less developed countries, it's also a problem that, I don't know who mentioned here that to send a kid to childcare costs a lot of money. When I was at the board at the World Bank, I remember even we had a good salary, and my colleagues that they have young kids and they have to send them to childcare, they say that they cost like a Ivory League university, you know, to have somebody to take care of a 2-year-old kid. So, and not to talk about those that they have to take care of disabled or elderly persons. There is a huge demand, but there is also a demand of goods and services that they don't have a market price, because that sector cannot think on paying what's the price of that. Like, again, childcare in a favela in Brazil, or in shanty town in Delhi or in Lagos, you know, there's no market there because nobody can pay. So if you can create these things, my last fights in Argentina were around the national system of childcare. Well, the proposal was to have a childcare center every 10 blocks around, that would be with people that the government would pay to take that job, and that would imply a large number of people. You increase the skills of that people. That's why sometimes, and again, in relation to gaining people that we follow us, it's not only, it's fundamentally important. I don't want to be misunderstood. The theoretical framework, nothing more practical than the good theory, and here we have a good theory, right? But if we can bring it down to more the application and the practicalities, that's going to be the place to bring the thing. When the ordinary common sense said, "Oh, you cannot spend more than what you get in your house," you know, they are bringing the practice to that high level of theory. Well, we should also start to bring those practices in order to gain people, not only economic students, because perhaps that's a fishing in the, or shooting in the zoo, as they say, because they are economists, they know. We should also try to convince, you know, like Randy did with the kids book and with other regular people that they don't think on economics, to bring into the common sense. It's what Gramsci called the cultural hegemony. We are losing that fight, because nowadays the cultural hegemony of younger population is the extreme liberalism or this anarchic conservatism that they end up in right-wing things. Well, we have to work on that. Again, we have to build the cultural hegemony in relation to all these topics.
Well, we can't beat that, Daniel. That's a great point. Yeah, yeah. Well, this is great, wasn't it, to hear from Emerson, coming the young future, and to be inspired by Daniel. On behalf of GIMS, it's great that we've got Neil and we've got Christian and Richard's with us, and of course Claire and Prue and Claire. But I'm going to hand over, I hope, to Prue just to round it up.
So what can I actually say? I think it's I'd just like to say thank you to our audience for coming and sharing with us this very special occasion, and not to mention the authors who have given us a flavour of the chapters, which hopefully will have you all rushing to buy a book. Special thank you too to Christian from the MMT podcast, with whom we really share this important task, for his contribution to the day. We need more than ever to work together and to build that, create that public awareness through the written word, the video, or through audio podcasts, to suit everybody's learning needs, because we all learn in different ways. Basically what we're aiming to do here is to educate for a better future. So we hope you've enjoyed the day, and if you want to keep in touch, GIMS can be found on social media, as I'm sure many of you already know: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn. I think that's all, isn't it, Claire?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. And if you want to receive a newsletter, we do them every now and then, you just need to sign up on our website. And also, finally, we are a really small organisation, and we depend on donations to fund our work. So if you can spare some cash, you can find the donate button on our website, and as some, I don't know, supermarket says, every little helps. So all that remains for me today is to say thank you so much for coming. It's been a really lovely day, particularly after 3 years of not being able to get together in a group and share something. So thank you for coming, and I wish you all a very safe journey home. Thank you so much.